Track 30, The Woman in White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Read by
Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Track 30.
The Third Epoch. 9. I left the house, feeling that Mrs. Catherick had helped me a step forward in spite of herself. Before I had reached the turning which led out of the square, my attention was suddenly aroused by the sound of a door closing behind me. I looked round and saw an undersized man in black on the doorstep of a house, which, as well as I could judge, stood next to Mrs. Catherick's place of abode. Next to it, on the side nearest to me. The man did not hesitate a moment about the direction he should take. He rapidly advanced towards the turning at which I had stopped. I recognized him as the lawyer's clerk, who had preceded me in my visit to Blackwater Park, and who had tried to pick a quarrel with me when I had asked him if I could see the house. I waited where I was to ascertain whether his object was to come to close quarters and speak on this occasion. To my surprise, he passed on rapidly without saying a word, without even looking up in my face as he went by. This was such a complete inversion of the course of proceeding which I had every reason to expect on his part, that my curiosity, or rather my suspicion, was aroused, and I determined on my side to keep him cautiously in view, and to discover what the business might be in which he was now employed. Without caring whether he saw me or not, I walked after him. He never looked back, and he led me straight through the streets to the railway station. The train was on the point of starting, and 2 or 3 passengers who were late were clustering round the small opening through which the tickets were issued. I joined them, and distinctly heard the lawyer's clerk demand a ticket for the Blackwater station. I satisfied myself that he had actually left by the train before I came away. There was only one interpretation I could place on what I had just seen and heard. I had unquestionably observed the man leaving a house which closely adjoined Mrs. Catherick's residence. He had probably been placed there by Sir Percival's directions as a lodger, in anticipation of my inquiries leading me sooner or later to communicate with Mrs. Catherick. He had doubtless seen me go in and come out, and he had hurried away to the first train to make his report at Blackwater Park, to which place Sir Percival would naturally betake himself, knowing what he evidently knew of my movements, in order to be ready on the spot if I returned to Hampshire. Before many days were over, there seemed every likelihood now that he and I might meet. Whatever results events might be destined to produce, I resolved to pursue my own course, straight to the end in view, without stopping or turning aside for Sir Percival or for anyone. The great responsibility which weighed on me heavily in London, the responsibility of so guiding my slightest actions as to prevent them from leading accidentally to the discovery of Laura's place of refuge, was removed, now that I was in Hampshire. I could go and come as I pleased at Welmingham, and if I chanced to fail in observing any necessary precautions, the immediate results at least would affect no one but myself. When I left the station, the winter evening was beginning to close in. There was little hope of continuing my inquiries after dark to any useful purpose in a neighbourhood that was strange to me. Accordingly, I made my way to the nearest hotel, and ordered my dinner and my bed. This done, I wrote to Marian to tell her that I was safe and well, and that I had fair prospects of success. I had directed her, on leaving home, to address the first letter she wrote to me, the letter I expected to receive the next morning, to the post office, Welmingham, and I now begged her to send the second day's letter to the same address. I could easily receive it by writing to the postmaster if I happened to be away from the town when it arrived. The coffee-room of the hotel, as it grew late in the evening, became a perfect solitude. I was left to reflect on what I had accomplished that afternoon as uninterruptedly as if the house had been my own. Before I retired to rest, I had attentively thought over my extraordinary interview with Mrs. Catherick from beginning to end, and had verified at my leisure the conclusions which I had hastily drawn in the earlier part of the day. The vestry of Old Welmingham Church was the starting point from which my mind slowly worked its way back through all that I had heard Mrs. Catherick say, and through all I had seen Mrs. Catherick do. At the time when the neighbourhood of the vestry was first referred to in my presence by Mrs. Clements, I had thought it the strangest and most unaccountable of all places for Sir Percival to select for a clandestine meeting with the clerk's wife. Influenced by this impression and by no other, I had mentioned the vestry of the church before Mrs. Catherick on pure speculation. It represented one of the minor peculiarities of the story which occurred to me while I was speaking. I was prepared for her answering me confusedly or angrily, but the blank terror that seized her when I said the words took me completely by surprise. I had long before associated Sir Percival's secret with the concealment of a serious crime which Mrs. Catherick knew of, but I had gone no further than this. Now, the woman's paroxysm of terror associated the crime, either directly or indirectly, with the vestry, and convinced me that she had been more than the mere witness of it. She was also the accomplice, beyond a doubt. What had been the nature of the crime? Surely there was a contemptible side to it, as well as a dangerous side, or Mrs. Catherick would not have repeated my own words, referring to Sir Percival's rank and power with such marked disdain as she had certainly displayed. It was a contemptible crime, then, and a dangerous crime, and she had shared in it, and it was associated with the vestry of the church. The next consideration to be disposed of led me a step further from this point. Mrs. Catherick's undisguised contempt for Sir Percival plainly extended to his mother as well. She had referred with the bitterest sarcasm to the great family he had descended from, especially on the mother's side. What did this mean? There appeared to be only two explanations for it. Either his mother's birth had been low, or his mother's reputation was damaged by some hidden flaw with which Mrs. Catherick and Sir Percival were both privately acquainted. I could only put the first explanation to the test by looking at the register of her marriage, and so ascertaining her maiden name and her parentage as a preliminary to further inquiries. On the other hand, if the second case supposed were the true one, what had been the flaw in her reputation? Remembering the account which Marian had given me of Sir Percival's father and mother, and of the suspiciously unsocial, secluded life they had both led, I now asked myself whether it might not be possible that his mother had never been married at all. Here again the register might, by offering written evidence of the marriage, prove to me, at any rate, that this doubt had no foundation in truth. But where was the register to be found? At this point I took up the conclusions which I had previously formed, and the same mental process which had discovered the locality of the concealed crime now lodged the register also in the vestry of Old Birmingham Church. These were the results of my interview with Mrs. Catherick. These were the various considerations, all steadily converging to one point, which decided the course of my proceedings on the next day. The morning was cloudy and lowering, but no rain fell. I left my bag at the hotel to wait there until I called for it, and, after inquiring the way, set forth on foot for Old Birmingham Church. It was a walk of rather more than 2 miles, the ground rising slowly all the way. On the highest point stood the church, an ancient weather-beaten building, with heavy buttresses at its sides, and a clumsy square tower in front. The vestry at the back was built out from the church, and seemed to be of the same age. Round the building, at intervals, appeared the remains of the village which Mrs. Clements had described to me as her husband's place of abode in the former years, and which the principal inhabitants had long since deserted for the new town. Some of the empty houses had been dismantled to their outer walls, some had been left to decay with time, and some were still inhabited by persons evidently of the poorest class. It was a dreary scene, and yet in the worst aspect of its ruin, not so dreary as the modern town that I had just left. Here there was the brown, breezy sweep of the surrounding fields for the eye to repose on. Here the trees, leafless as they were, still varied the monotony of the prospect, and helped the mind to look forward to summer-time and shade. As I moved away from the back of the church, and passed some of the dismantled cottages in search of a person who might direct me to the clerk, I saw 2 men saunter out after me from behind the wall. The tallest of the 2, a stout, muscular man in the dress of a gamekeeper, was a stranger to me. The other was one of the men who had followed me in London on the day when I left Mr. Kyle's office. I had taken particular notice of him at the time, and felt sure that I was not mistaken in identifying the fellow on this occasion. Neither he nor his companion attempted to speak to me, and both kept themselves at a respectful distance, but the motive of their presence in the neighbourhood of the church was plainly apparent. It was exactly as I had supposed. Sir Percival was already prepared for me. My visit to Mrs. Catterick had been reported to him the evening before, and those two men had been placed on the lookout near the church, in anticipation of my appearance at Old Welmingham. If I had wanted any further proof of my investigations had taken the right direction at last, the plan now adopted for watching me would have supplied it. I walked on, away from the church, until I reached one of the inhabited houses, with a patch of kitchen garden attached to it, on which a labourer was at work. He directed me to the clerk's abode, a cottage at some little distance off, standing by itself on the outskirts of the forsaken village. The clerk was indoors, and was just putting on his greatcoat. He was a cheerful, familiar, loudly talkative old man, with a very poor opinion, as I soon discovered, of the place in which he lived, and a happy sense of superiority to his neighbours in virtue of the great personal distinction of having once been in London. "It's well you came so early, sir," said the old man, when I had mentioned the object of my visit. "I should have been away in 10 minutes or more. Parish business, and a goodish long trot before it's all done for a man at my age. But bless you, I'm strong in my legs still. As long as a man don't give it his legs, there's a great deal of work left in him. Don't you think so yourself, sir?" He took his keys down while he was talking from a hook behind the fireplace, and locked his cottage door behind us. "Nobody at home to keep house for me," said the clerk, with a cheerful sense of perfect freedom from all family encumbrances. "My wife's in the churchyard there, and my children are all married. Wretched place this, isn't it, sir? But the parish is a large one. Every man couldn't get through the business as I do. There's learning does it, and I've had my share and a little more. I can talk the Queen's English, God bless the Queen, and that's more than most of the people about here can do. You're from London, I suppose, sir? I've been in London a matter of 25 years ago. What's the news there now, if you please?" Chattering on in this way, he led me back to the vestry. I looked about to see if the two spies were still in sight. They were not visible anywhere, and having discovered my application to the clerk, they had probably concealed themselves where they could watch my next proceedings in perfect freedom. The vestry door was of stout old oak, studded with strong nails, and the clerk put his large, heavy key into the lock with the air of a man who knew that he had a difficulty to encounter, and who was not quite certain, creditably, of conquering it. "I'm obliged to bring you this way, sir," he said, "because the door from the vestry to the church is bolted on the vestry side. We might have got in through the church otherwise. This is a perverse lock, if ever there was one yet. It's big enough for a prison door. It's been hampered over again and again, and it ought to be changed for a new one. I've mentioned that to the churchwarden 50 times over at least, and he's always saying, 'I'll see about it,' and he never does see. It's sort of a lost corner, this place. Not like London, is it, sir? Bless you, we all asleep here. We don't march with the times." After some twisting and turning of the key, the heavy lock yielded, and he opened the door. The vestry was larger than I should have supposed it to be, judging from the outside only. It was a dim, mouldy, melancholy old room, with a low, raftered ceiling. Round two sides of it, the sides nearest to the interior of the church, ran heavy wooden presses, worm-eaten and gaping with age. Hooked to the inner corner of one of these presses hung several surplices, all bulging out at their lower ends in an irreverent-looking bundle of limp drapery. Below the surplices on the floor stood 3 packing cases with the lids half off, half on, and the straw profusely bursting out of their cracks and crevices in every direction. Behind them, in the corner, was a litter of dusty papers, some large, rolled up like architects' plans, some loosely strung together on files like bills or letters. The room had once been lighted by a small side window, but this had been bricked up, and the lantern skylight was now substituted for it. The atmosphere of the place was heavy and mouldy. being rendered additionally oppressive by the closing of the door which led to the church. This door also was composed of solid oak, and was bolted at the top and bottom on the vestry side. "We might be tied here, mightn't we, sir?" said the cheerful clerk. "But when you're in a lost corner of a place like this, what are you to do? Why, look here now. Just look at these packing cases. There they've been for a year or more, ready to go down to London. There they are, littering the place, and there they'll stop as long as the nails hold them together. I'll tell you what, sir, as I said before, this is not London. We are all asleep here. Bless you, we don't march with the times." "What is there in the packing cases?" I asked. "Bits of old wood carvings from the pulpit, panels from the chancel, and images from the organ loft," said the clerk. "Portraits of the 12 apostles in wood, and not a whole nose among 'em, all broken and worm-eaten, and crumbling to dust at the edges, brittle as crockery, sir, and as old as the church, if not older." "And why were they going to London? To be repaired?" "That's it, sir, to be repaired, and where they were past repair, to be copied in sound wood. But bless you, the money fell short, and there they are, waiting for new subscriptions, and nobody to subscribe. It was all done a year ago, sir. 6 gentlemen dined together about it at the hotel in the new town. They made speeches and passed resolutions, and put their names down, and printed off thousands of prospectuses. Beautiful prospectuses, sir, all flourished over with Gothic devices in red ink, saying it was a disgrace not to restore the church and repair the famous carvings, and so on. There are the prospectuses that couldn't be distributed, and the architect's plans and estimates, and the whole correspondence which set everybody at loggerheads and ended in a dispute, all down together in that corner, behind the packing cases. The money dribbled in a little at first, but what can you expect out of London? There was just enough, you know, to pack the broken carvings and get the estimates and pay the printer's bill, and after that there wasn't a halfpenny left. There the things are, as I said before. We have nowhere else to put 'em. Nobody in a new town cares about accommodating us. We're in a lost corner, and this is an untidy vestry, and who's to help it? That's what I want to know." My anxiety to examine the register did not dispose me to offer much encouragement to the old man's talkativeness. I agreed with him that nobody could help the untidiness of the vestry, and then suggested that we should proceed to our business without more delay. Aye, the marriage register, to be sure," said the clerk, taking a little bunch of keys from his pocket. "How far do you want to go back, sir?" Marian had informed me of Sir Percival's age at the time when we had spoken together of his marriage engagement with Laura. She had then described him as being 45 years old. Calculating back from this, and making due allowance for the year that had passed since I had gained my information, I found that he must have been born in 1804, and that I might safely start on my search through the register from that date. "I want to begin with the year 1804, I said. "Which way after that, sir?" asked the clerk. "Forwards to our time, or backwards away from us?" "Backwards from 1804. He opened the door of one of the presses, the press from the side of which the surplices were hanging, and produced a large volume in greasy brown leather. I was struck by the insecurity of the place in which the register was kept. The door of the press was warped and cracked with age, and the lock was of the smallest and commonest kind. I could have forced it easily with a walking stick I carried in my hand. "Is that considered a sufficiently secure place for the register?" I inquired. "Surely a book of such importance as this ought to be protected by a better lock, and kept carefully in an iron safe." "Well, now, that's curious," said the clerk, shutting up the book again just after he'd opened it, and smacking his hand cheerfully on the cover. "Those were the very words my old master was always saying years and years ago when I was a lad. Why isn't the register, meaning this register here under my hand, why isn't it kept in an iron safe? If I've heard him say that once, I've heard him say it 100 times. He was a solicitor in those days, sir, who had the appointment of vestry clerk to this church. A fine, hearty old gentleman, and the most particular man breathing. As long as he lived, he kept a copy of this book in his office at Knowlesbury, and had it posted up regular, from time to time, to correspond with the fresh entries here. You'd hardly think it, but he had his own appointed days, once or twice in every quarter, for riding over to this church on his old white pony to check the copy by the register with his own eyes and hands. How do I know, he used to say, how do I know that the register in this vestry may not be stolen or destroyed? Why isn't it kept in an iron safe? Why can't I make other people as careful as I am myself? Some of these days there will be an accident happen, and when the register's lost, then the parish will find out the value of my copy. He used to take his pinch of snuff after that, and look about him as bold as a lord. The like of him for doing business isn't easy to find now. You may go to London and not match him, even there. Which year did you say, sir? 1800 and what? 1804, I replied, mentally resolving to give the old man no more opportunities of talking until my examination of the register was over. The clerk put on his spectacles and turned over the leaves of the register, carefully wetting his finger and thumb at every third page. Here it is, sir, he said, with another cheerful smack on the open volume. There is the year you want. As I was ignorant of the month in which Sir Percival was born, I began my backward search with the early part of the year. The register book was of the old-fashioned kind, the entries being all made on blank pages in manuscript, and the divisions which separated them being indicated by ink lines drawn across the page at the close of each entry. I reached the beginning of the year 1804 without encountering the marriage, and then travelled back through December 1803, through November and October, not through September also. Under the heading of that month, in the year, I found the marriage. I looked carefully at the entry. It was at the bottom of a page, and was, for want of room, compressed into a smaller space than occupied by the marriages above. The marriages immediately before it was impressed on my attention by the circumstance of the bridegroom's Christian name being the same as my own. The entry immediately following it, on the top of the next page, was noticeable in another way from the large space it occupied. The record in this case registering the marriages of two brothers at the same time. The register of the marriage of Sir Felix Glyde was in no respect remarkable except for the narrowness of the space in which it was compressed at the bottom of the page. The information about his wife was the usual information given in such cases. She was described as Cecilia Jane Elster, of Parkview Cottages, Knowlesbury, only daughter of the late Patrick Elster, Esquire, formerly of Bath. I noted down these particulars in my pocket-book, feeling as I did so both doubtful and disheartened about my next proceedings. The secret, which I had believed until this moment to be within my grasp, now seemed further from my reach than ever. What suggestions of any mystery unexplained had arisen out of my visit to the vestry? I saw no suggestions anywhere. What progress had I made towards discovering the suspected stain on the reputation of Sir Percival's mother? The one fact I had ascertained vindicated her reputation. Fresh doubts, fresh difficulties, fresh delays began to open before me in interminable prospect. What was I to do next? The one immediate resource left to me appeared to be this. I might institute inquiries about Miss Elster of Knowlesbury, on the chance of advancing towards the main object of my investigation by first discovering the secret of Mrs. Catherick's contempt for Sir Percival's mother. "Have you found what you wanted, sir?" asked the clerk as I closed the register book. "Yes," I replied, "but I have some inquiries still to make. I suppose the clergyman who officiated here in the year 1803 is no longer alive?" No, sir. He was dead 3 or 4 years before I came here, and that was as long ago as the year 27. "I got this place, sir," persisted my talkative old friend, "through the clerk before me leaving it. They say he was driven out of house and home by his wife, and she's living still in the new town there. I don't know the rights of the story myself. All I know is I got the place. Mr. Wansborough got it for me, the son of my old master that I was telling you of. He's a free, pleasant gentleman as ever lives. Rides to the hounds, keeps his pointers and all that. He's vestry clerk here now, and his father was before him." "Did you not tell me that your former master lived at Knowlesbury?" I asked, calling to mind the long story about the precise gentleman of the old school with which my talkative friend had wearied me before he opened the register book. "Yes, to be sure, sir," replied the clerk. "Old Mr. Wansborough lived at Knowlesbury. Young Mr. Wansborough lives there too. You said just now that he was vestry clerk, like his father before him. I'm not quite sure that I know what a vestry clerk is. Don't you indeed, sir? And you come from London too. Every parish church, you know, has a vestry clerk and a parish clerk. The parish clerk is a man like me, except that I've got a deal more learning than most of them, though I don't boast of it. And the vestry clerk is a sort of appointment that the lawyers get, and if there's any business to be done for the vestry, why, they go and do it. It's just the same in London. Every parish church there has got its vestry clerk, and you may take my word for it, he's sure to be a lawyer. Then young Mr. Wansborough is a lawyer, I suppose? Of course he is, sir. A lawyer in High Street, Knowlesbury, the old offices that his father had before him. The number of times I've swept those offices out and seen the old gentleman come trotting into business on his white pony, looking right and left all down the street, and nodding to everybody. Bless you, he was a popular character. He'd have done in London. How far is it to Knowlesbury from this place? Oh, a long stretch, sir, said the clerk, with that exaggerated idea of distances and that vivid perception of difficulties in getting from place to place which is peculiar to all country people. Nigh on 5 mile, I can tell you. It was still early in the forenoon. There was plenty of time for a walk to Knowlesbury and back to Welmingham. There was no person probably in the town who was fitter to assist my inquiries about the character and position of Sir Percival's mother before her marriage than the local solicitor. Resolving to go at once to Knowlesbury on foot, I led the way out of the vestry. "Thank you kindly, sir," said the clerk, as I slipped my little present into his hand. "Are you really going to walk all the way to Knowlesbury and back? Well, you're strong in your legs, too. And what a blessing that is, isn't it? There's the road, you can't miss it. I wish I was going your way. It's pleasant to meet with a gentleman from London at the lost corner like this. One hears the news. Wish you good morning, sir. Thank you kindly once more." We parted. As I left the church behind me, I looked back, and there were the 2 men again on the road below, with a third in their company, that third person being the short man in black, whom I had traced to the railway station the evening before. The 3 stood talking together for a little while, then separated. The man in black went away by himself towards Welmingham. The other 2 remained together, evidently waiting to follow me as soon as I walked on. I proceeded on my way without letting the fellows see that I took any special notice of them. They caused me no conscious irritation of feeling at that moment. On the contrary, they rather revived my sinking hopes. In the surprise of discovering the evidence of the marriage, I had forgotten the inference I had first drawn on perceiving the men in the neighbourhood of the vestry. Their reappearance reminded me that Sir Percival had anticipated my visit to Old Welmingham Church as the next result of my interview with Mrs. Catherick. Otherwise he would never have placed his spies there to wait for me. Smoothly and fairly as appearances looked in the vestry, there was something wrong beneath them. There was something in the register book, for aught I knew, that I had not discovered yet.
End of Track 30. Track 31. The Woman in White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Read by
Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Track 31.
The Third Epoch. 10. Once out of sight of the church, I pressed forward briskly on my way to Knowlesbury. The road was, for the most part, straight and level. Whenever I looked back over it, I saw the 2 spies steadily following me. For the greater part of the way they kept at a safe distance behind, but once or twice quickened their pace, as if with the purpose of overtaking me. Then stopped, consulted together, and fell back again to their former position. They had some special object evidently in view, and they seemed to be hesitating or differing about the best means of accomplishing it. I could not guess exactly what their design might be, but I felt serious doubts of reaching Knowlesbury without some mischance happening to me on the way. These doubts were realized. I had just entered on a lonely part of the road, with a sharp turn at some distance ahead, and had just concluded, calculating by time, that I must be getting near to the town, when suddenly I heard the steps of the men close behind me. Before I could look round, one of them, the man by whom I had been followed in London, passed rapidly on my left side and hustled me with his shoulder. I had been more irritated by the manner in which he and his companion had dogged my steps all the way from Old Birmingham than I was myself aware of, and I unfortunately pushed the fellow away smartly with my open hand. He instantly shouted for help. His companion, the tall man in the gamekeeper's clothes, sprang to my right side, and the next moment the two scoundrels held me pinioned between them in the middle of the road. The conviction that a trap had been laid for me, and the vexation of knowing that I had fallen into it, fortunately restrained me from making my position still worse by an unavailing struggle with the two men, one of whom would in all probability have been more than a match for me single-handed. I repressed the first natural movement by which I had attempted to shake them off, and looked about to see if there was any person nearby to whom I could appeal. A labourer was at work in an adjoining field who must have witnessed all that had passed. I called to him to follow us to the town. He shook his head with stolid obstinacy, and walked away in the direction of a cottage which stood back from the high road. At the same time, the men who held me between them declared their intention of charging me with an assault. I was cool enough and wise enough now to make no opposition. "Drop your hold of my arms," I said, "and I will go with you to the town." The man in the gamekeeper's dress roughly refused, but the shorter man was sharp enough to look to consequences, and not to let his companion commit himself by unnecessary violence. He made a sign to the other, and I walked on between them with my arms free. We reached the turning in the road, and there, close before us, were the suburbs of Knowlesbury. One of the local policemen was walking along the path by the roadside. The men at once appealed to him. He replied that the magistrate was then sitting at the town hall, and recommended that we should appear before him immediately. We went on to the town hall. The clerk made out a formal summons, and the charge was preferred against me, with the customary exaggeration and the customary perversions of the truth on such occasions. The magistrate, an ill-tempered man, with a sour enjoyment in the exercise of his own power, inquired if anyone on or near the road had witnessed the assault, and greatly to my surprise the complainant admitted the presence of the labourer in the field. I was enlightened, however, as to the object of the admission by the magistrate's next words. He remanded me at once for the production of the witness, expressing at the same time his willingness to take bail for my reappearance if I could produce one responsible surety to offer for it. If I had been known in the town, he would have liberated me on my own recognizances. But as I was a total stranger, it was necessary that I should find responsible bail. The whole object of the stratagem was now disclosed to me. It had been so managed as to make a remand necessary in a town where I was a perfect stranger, and where I could not hope to get my liberty on bail. The remand merely extended over 3 days, until the next sitting of the magistrate. But in that time, while I was in confinement, Sir Percival might use any means he pleased to embarrass my future proceedings, perhaps to screen himself from detection altogether, without the slightest fear of any hindrance on my part. At the end of the 3 days, the charge would no doubt be withdrawn, and the attendance of the witness would be perfectly useless. My indignation, I may almost say my despair, at this mischievous check on all further progress, so base and trifling in itself, and yet so disheartening and so serious in its probable results, quite unfitted me at first to reflect on the best means of extricating myself from the dilemma in which I now stood. I had the folly to call for writing materials, and to think privately of communicating my real position to the magistrate. The hopelessness and the imprudence of this proceeding failed to strike me before I had actually written the opening lines of the letter. It was not until I had pushed the paper away, not till I am ashamed to say I had almost allowed the vexation of my hopeless position to conquer me, that a course of action suddenly occurred to my mind, which Sir Percival had probably not anticipated, and which might set me free again in a few hours. I determined to communicate the situation in which I was placed to Mr. Dawson of Oak Lodge. I had visited this gentleman's house, it will be remembered, on the time of my first inquiries in the Blackwater Park neighbourhood, and I had presented to him a letter of introduction from Miss Halcombe, in which she recommended me to his friendly attention in the strongest terms. I now wrote, referring to this letter, and to what I had previously told Mr. Dawson of the delicate and dangerous nature of my inquiries. I had not revealed to him the truth about Laura, having merely described my errand as being the utmost importance to private family interests, with which Miss Halcombe was concerned. Using the same caution still, I now accounted for my presence at Knowlesbury in the same manner, and I put it to the doctor to say whether the trust reposed in me by a lady whom he well knew, and the hospitality I had myself received in his house, justified me or not in asking him to come to my assistance in a place where I was quite friendless. I obtained permission to hire a messenger to drive away at once with my letter in a conveyance which might be used to bring the doctor back immediately. Oak Lodge was on the Knowlesbury side of Blackwater. The man declared he could drive there in 40 minutes, and could bring Mr. Dawson back in 40 more. I directed him to follow the doctor wherever he might happen to be, if he was not at home, and then sat down to wait for the result, with all the patience and all the hope that I could summon to help me. It was not quite 1:30 when the messenger departed. Before 3:30 he returned and brought the doctor with him. Mr. Dawson's kindness, and the delicacy with which he treated his prompt assistance, quite as a matter of course, almost overpowered me. The bail required was offered and accepted immediately. Before 4 o'clock on that afternoon I was again shaking hands warmly with the good old doctor, a free man again, in the streets of Knowlesbury. Mr. Dawson hospitably invited me to go back with him to Oak Lodge, and to take up my quarters there for the night. I could only reply that my time was not my own, and I could only ask him to let me pay my visit in a few days, when I might repeat my thanks, and offer to him all the explanations which I felt to be only his due, but which I was not then in a position to make. We parted, with friendly assurances on both sides, and I turned my steps at once to Mr. Wansborough's office in the High Street. Time was now of the last importance. The news of my being free on bail would reach Sir Percival to an absolute certainty before night. If the next few hours did not put me in a position to justify my worst fears, and to hold him helpless at my mercy, I might lose every inch of the ground I had gained, never to recover it again. The unscrupulous nature of the man, the local influence he possessed, the desperate peril of exposure with which my blindfold inquiries threatened him, all warned me to press on with positive discovery, without the useless waste of a single minute. I had found time to think while I was waiting for Mr. Dawson's arrival, and I had well employed it. Certain portions of the conversation of the talkative old clerk, which had wearied me at the time, now recurred to my memory with a new significance, and a suspicion crossed my mind darkly, which had not occurred to me while I was in the vestry. On my way to Knowlesbury, I had only proposed to apply to Mr. Wansborough for information on the subject of Sir Percival's mother. My object was now to examine the duplicate register of Old Birmingham Church. Mr. Wansborough was in his office when I inquired for him. He was a jovial, red-faced, easy-looking man, more like a country squire than a lawyer, and he seemed to be both surprised and amused by my application. He had heard of his father's copy of the register, but had not even seen it himself. It had never been inquired after, and it was, no doubt, in the strong-room, among other papers, that had not been disturbed since his father's death. It was a pity, Mr. Wansborough said, that the old gentleman was not alive to hear his precious copy asked for at last. He would have ridden his favourite hobby harder than ever now. How had I come to hear of the copy? Was it through anybody in the town? I parried the question as well as I could. It was impossible at this stage of the investigation to be too cautious, and it was just as well not to let Mr. Wansborough know prematurely that I had already examined the original register. I described myself, therefore, as pursuing a family inquiry, to the object of which every possible saving of time was of great importance. I was anxious to send certain particulars to London by that day's post, and one look at the duplicate register, paying, of course, the necessary fees, might supply what I required and save me a further journey to Old Birmingham. I added that, in the event of my subsequently requiring a copy of the original register, I should make application to Mr. Wansborough's office to furnish me with the document. After this explanation, no objection was made to producing the copy. A clerk was sent to the strong-room, and after some delay returned with the volume. It was of exactly the same size as the volume in the vestry, the only difference being that the copy was more smartly bound. I took it with me to an unoccupied desk. My hands were trembling. My head was burning hot. I felt the necessity of concealing my agitation as well as I could from the persons around me in the room, before I ventured on opening the book. On the blank page at the beginning, to which I first turned, were traced some lines in faded ink. They contained these words: "Copy of the marriage register of Welmingham Parish Church, executed under my orders and afterwards compared entry by entry with the original by myself. Signed, Robert Wansborough, vestry clerk." Below this note there was a line added in another handwriting as follows: "Extending from the 1st of January 1800 to the 30th of June 1815. I turned to the month of September 1803. I found the marriage of the man whose Christian name was the same as my own. I found the double register of the marriages of the two brothers. And between these entries at the bottom of the page, nothing. Not a vestige of the entry which recorded the marriage of Sir Felix Glyde and Cecilia Jane Elster in the register of the church. My heart gave a great bound, and throbbed as if it would stifle me. I looked again. I was afraid to believe the evidence of my own eyes. No, not a doubt, the marriage was not there. The entries on the copy occupied exactly the same places on the page as the entries in the original. The last entry on one page recorded the marriage of the man with my Christian name. Below it there was a blank space, a space evidently left because it was too narrow, to contain the entry of the marriages of the two brothers, which in the copy, as in the original, occupied the top of the next page. That space told the whole story. There it must have remained in the church register from 1803, when the marriages had been solemnized and the copy had been made, to 1827, when Sir Percival appeared at Old Welmingham. Here at Knowlesbury was the chance of committing the forgery shown to me in the copy, and there at Old Welmingham was the forgery committed in the register of the church. My head turned giddy. I held by the desk to keep myself from falling. Of all the suspicions which had struck me in relation to that desperate man, not one had been near the truth. The idea that he was not Sir Percival Glyde at all, that he had no more claim to the baronetcy and to Blackwater Park than the poorest labourer who worked on the estate, had never once occurred to my mind. At one time I had thought that he might be Anne Catherick's father. At another time I had thought that he might have been Anne Catherick's husband. The offence of which he was really guilty had been from first to last beyond the widest reach of my imagination. The paltry means by which the fraud had been effected, the magnitude and daring of the crime that it represented, the horror of the consequences involved in its discovery, overwhelmed me. Who could wonder now at the brute restlessness of the wretch's life, at his desperate alternations between abject duplicity and reckless violence, at the madness of guilty distrust, which had made him imprison Anne Catherick in the asylum, and had given him over to the vile conspiracy against his wife, on the bare suspicion that the one and the other knew his terrible secret. The disclosure of that secret might in past years have hanged him, might now transport him for life. The disclosure of that secret, even if the sufferers by his deception spared him the penalties of the law, would deprive him at one blow of the name, the rank, the estate, the whole social existence that he had usurped. This was the secret, and it was mine. A word from me, and house, lands, baronetcy were gone from him forever. A word from me, and he was driven out into the world, a nameless, penniless, friendless outcast. The man's whole future hung on my lips, and he knew it by this time as certainly as I did. That last thought steadied me. Interests far more precious than my own depended on the caution which must now guide my slightest actions. There was no possible treachery which Sir Percival might not attempt against me. In the danger and desperation of his position, he would be staggered by no risks. He would recoil at no crime. He would literally hesitate at nothing to save himself. I considered for a minute. My first necessity was to secure positive evidence in writing of the discovery that I had just made, and in the event of any personal misadventure happening to me, to place that evidence beyond Sir Percival's reach. The copy of the register was surely to be safe in Mr. Wansborough's strong room. but the position of the original in the vestry was, as I had seen with my own eyes, anything but secure. In this emergency I resolved to return to the church, to apply again to the clerk, and to take the necessary extract from the register before I slept that night. I was not then aware that a legally certified copy was necessary, and that no document merely drawn out by myself could claim the proper importance as a proof. I was not aware of this, and my determination to keep my present proceedings a secret prevented me from asking any questions which might have procured the necessary information. My one anxiety was the anxiety to get back to old Welmingham. I made the best excuses I could for the discomposure in my face and manner which Mr. Wansborough had already noticed, laid the necessary fee on his table, arranged that I should write him in a day or two, and left the office, with my head in a whirl and my blood throbbing through my veins at fever heat. It was just getting dark. The idea occurred to me that I might be followed again and attacked on the high road. My walking stick was a light one, of little or no use for purposes of defence. I stopped before leaving Knowlesbury, and bought a stout country cudgel, short and heavy in the head. With this homely weapon, if any one man tried to stop me, I was a match for him. If more than one attacked me, I could trust to my heels. In my school days I'd been a noted runner, and I had not wanted for practice since, in the latter time of my experience in Central America. I started from the town at a brisk pace, and kept in the middle of the road. A small misty rain was falling, and it was impossible for the first half of the way to make sure whether I was followed or not. But at the last half of my journey, when I supposed myself to be about 2 miles from the church, I saw a man run by me in the rain, and then heard the gate of a field by the roadside shut sharply. I kept straight on, with my cudgel ready in my hand, and my ears on the alert, and my eyes straining to see through the mist and the darkness. Before I had advanced 100 yards, there was a rustling in the hedge on my right, and 3 men sprang out into the road. I drew aside on the instant to the footpath. The 2 foremost men were carried beyond me before they could check themselves. The third was as quick as lightning. He stopped, half-turned, and struck at me with his stick. The blow was aimed at hazard, and it was not a severe one. It fell on my left shoulder. I returned it heavily on his head. He staggered back and jostled his 2 companions, just as they were both rushing at me. This circumstance gave me a moment's start. I slipped by them and took to the middle of the road again at the top of my speed. The 2 unhurt men pursued me. They were both good runners. The road was smooth and level, and for the first 5 minutes or more I was conscious that I did not gain on them. It was perilous work to run for long in the darkness. I could barely see the dim black line of the hedges on either side, and any chance obstacle in the road would have thrown me down for a certainty. Ere long I felt the ground changing. It descended from the level at a turn, and then rose again beyond. Downhill the men rather gained on me, but uphill I began to distance them. The rapid, regular thump of their feet grew fainter in my ear, and I calculated by the sound that I was far enough in advance to take to the fields with a good chance of their passing me in the darkness. Diverging to the footpath, I made for the first break that I could guess at rather than see in the hedge. It proved to be a closed gate. I vaulted over, and finding myself in a field, kept across it steadily with my back to the road. I heard the men pass the gate still running, and then in a minute more heard one of them call to the other to come back. It was no matter what they did now. I was out of their sight and out of their hearing. I kept straight across the field, and, when I had reached the farther extremity of it, waited there for a minute to recover my breath. It was impossible to venture back to the road, but I was determined nevertheless to get to old Welmingham that evening. Neither moon nor stars appeared to guide me. I only knew that I had kept the wind and rain at my back on leaving Knowlesbury, and if I now kept them on my back still, I might at least be certain of not advancing altogether in the wrong direction. Proceeding on this plan, I crossed the country, meeting with no worse obstacles than hedges, ditches, and thickets, which every now and then obliged me to alter my course for a little while, until I found myself on a hillside, with the ground sloping away steeply before me. I descended to the bottom of the hollow, squeezed my way through a hedge, and got out into a lane. Having turned to the right on leaving the road, I now turned to the left, on the chance of regaining the line from which I had wandered. After following the muddy windings of the lane for 10 minutes or more, I saw a cottage with a light in one of the windows. The garden gate was open to the lane, and I went in at once to inquire my way. Before I could knock at the door, it was suddenly opened, and a man came running out with a lighted lantern in his hand. He stopped and held it up at the sight of me. We both started as we saw each other. My wanderings had led me to the outskirts of the village, and it had brought me out at the lower end of it. I was back at Old Welningham, and the man with the lantern was no other than my acquaintance of the morning, the parish clerk. His manner appeared to have altered strangely in the interval since I had last seen him. He looked suspicious and confused. His ruddy cheeks were deeply flushed, and his first words when he spoke were quite unintelligible to me. "Where are the keys?" he asked. "Have you taken them?" "What keys?" I repeated. "I have this moment come from Knowlesbury. What keys do you mean?" "The keys to the vestry." "Lord, save us and help us. What shall I do? The keys are gone. Do you hear?" cried the old man, shaking the lantern at me in his agitation. "The keys are gone." "How? When? Who can have taken them?" "I don't know," said the clerk, staring about him wildly in the darkness. "I've only just got back. I told you I had a long day's work this morning. I opened the door and shut the window down. It's open now. The window's open. Look, somebody's got in there and taken the keys." He turned to the casement window to show me that it was wide open. The door of the lantern came loose from its fastening as he swayed it round, and the wind blew the candle out instantly. "Get another light," I said, "and let's both of us go to the vestry together. Quick, quick!" I hurried him into the house. The treachery that I had every reason to expect, the treachery that might deprive me of every advantage I had gained, was at that moment perhaps in the process of accomplishment. My impatience to reach the church was so great that I could not remain inactive in the cottage while the clerk lit the lantern again. I walked out down the garden path into the lane. Before I had advanced 10 paces, a man approached me from the direction leading to the church. He spoke respectfully as we met. I could not see his face, but judging by his voice only, he was a perfect stranger to me. "I beg your pardon, Sir Percival," he began. I stopped him before he could say more. "The darkness misleads you," I said. "I am not Sir Percival." The man drew back directly. "I thought it was my master," he muttered in a confused, doubtful way. "You expected to meet your master here?" "I was told to wait in the lane." With that answer he retraced his steps. I looked back at the cottage and saw the clerk coming out, with the lantern lighted once more. I took the old man's arm to help him on the more quickly. We hastened down the lane, and past the person who had accosted me. As well as I could see by the light of the lantern, he was a servant out of livery. "Who's that?" whispered the clerk. "Does he know anything about the keys?" "We won't wait to ask him," I replied. "We will go down to the vestry first." The church was not visible, even by daytime, until the end of the lane was reached. As we mounted the rising ground which led to the building from that point, one of the village children, a boy, came close up to us, attracted by the light we carried, and recognized the clerk. "I say, mister," said the boy, pulling officiously at the clerk's coat, "there be summat up yonder at the church. I heerd un lock the door on hisself. I heerd un strike a light wi' a match." The clerk trembled and leaned against me heavily. "Come, come," I said encouragingly. "We're not too late. We will catch the man, whoever he is. Keep the lantern and follow me as fast as you can." I mounted the hill rapidly. The dark mass of the church tower was the first object I discerned dimly against the night sky. As I turned aside to get round to the vestry, I heard heavy footsteps close to me. The servant had ascended to the church after us. "I don't mean any harm," he said, when I turned round on him. "I'm only looking for my master." The tones in which he spoke betrayed unmistakable fear. I took no notice of him and went on. The instant I turned the corner and came in view of the vestry, I saw the lantern skylight of the roof brilliantly lit up from within. It shone out with dazzling brightness against the murky, starless sky. I hurried through the churchyard to the door. As I got near, there was a strange smell stealing out of the damp night air. I heard a snapping noise inside, saw the light above go brighter and brighter. A pane of glass cracked. I ran to the door and put my hand on it. The vestry was on fire. Before I could move, before I could draw my breath after that discovery, I was horror-struck by the heavy thump against the door from the inside. I heard the key worked violently in the lock. I heard a man's voice behind the door, raised to a dreadful shrillness, shrieking for help. The servant who had followed me staggered back, shuddering, and dropped to his knees. "Oh, my God!" he said. "It's Sir Percival!" As the words passed his lips, the clerk joined us, and at the same moment there was another and last grating turn of the key in the lock. "Lord, have mercy on his soul," said the old man. "He's doomed and dead. He has hampered the lock." I rushed to the door. The one absorbing purpose that had filled all my thoughts, that had controlled all my actions for weeks and weeks past, vanished in an instant from my mind. All remembrance of the heartless injury the man's crimes had inflicted, of the love, the innocence, the happiness he had pitilessly laid waste, of the oath I had sworn in my own heart to summon him to the terrible reckoning that he deserved, passed from my memory like a dream. I remembered nothing but the horror of his situation. I felt nothing but the natural human impulse to save him from a frightful death. "Try the other door!" I shouted. "Try the door into the church. The lock's hampered. You're a dead man if you waste another moment on it." There had been no renewed cry for help when the key was turned for the last time. There was no sound now of any kind to give token that he was still alive. I heard nothing but the quickening crackle of the flames and the sharp snap of the glass in the skylight above. I looked round at my two companions. The servant had risen to his feet. He had taken the lantern and was holding it up vacantly at the door. Terror seemed to have struck him with downright idiocy. He waited at my heels. He followed me about when I moved, like a dog. The clerk sat crouched up on one of the tombstones, shivering and moaning to himself. The one moment in which I looked at them was enough to show me that they were both helpless. Hardly knowing what I did, acting desperately on the first impulse that occurred to me, I seized the servant and pushed him against the vestry wall. "Stoop," I said, "and hold by the stones. I'm going to climb over you to the roof. I'm going to break the skylight and give him some air." The man trembled from head to foot, but he held firm. I got on his back, with my cudgel in my mouth, seized the parapet with both hands, and was instantly on the roof. In a frantic hurry and agitation of the moment, it never struck me that I might let out the flame instead of letting in the air. I struck at the skylight, and battered in the cracked, loosened glass with a blow. The fire leapt out like a wild beast from its lair. If the wind had not chanced, in the position I occupied, to send it away from me, my exertions might have ended then and there. I crouched on the roof as the smoke poured above me with the flame. The gleams and flashes of the light showed me the servant's face staring up vacantly under the wall. The clerk risen to his feet on the tombstone, wringing his hands in despair, and the scanty population of the village, haggard men and terrified women, clustered beyond in the churchyard, all appearing and disappearing, in the red of the dreadful glare, in the black of the choking smoke, and the man beneath my feet, the man suffocating, burning, dying so near us all, so utterly beyond our reach. The thought half maddened me. I lowered myself from the roof by my hands and dropped to the ground. "The key of the church!" I shouted to the clerk. "We must try it that way. We may save him yet, if we can burst open the inner door." "No, no, no!" cried the old man. "No hope. The church key and the vestry key are on the same ring, both inside there." "Oh, sir, he's past saving. He's dust and ashes by this time." "They'll see the fire from the town," said a voice from among the men behind me. "There's an Injun in the town. They'll save the church." I called to that man. He had his wits about him. I called to him to come and speak to me. It would be a quarter of an hour at least before the town could reach us. The horror of remaining inactive all that time was more than I could face. In defiance of my own reason, I persuaded myself that the doomed and lost wretch in the vestry might still be lying senseless on the floor, might not be dead yet. If we broke open the door, might we save him? I knew the strength of the heavy oak. I knew the thickness of the nailed oak. I knew the hopelessness of assailing the one and the other by ordinary means. But surely there were beams still left in the dismantled cottages near the church. What if we got one and used it as a battering ram against the door? The thought leaped through me like the fire leaping out of the shattered skylight. I appealed to the man who had spoken first, of the fire engine in the town. Have you got any pickaxes handy? Yes, they had. And a hatchet and a saw and a bit of rope. Yes, yes, yes. I ran down among the villagers with the lantern in my hand. 5 shillings apiece to every man who helps me. They started into life at the words. That ravenous second hunger of poverty, the hunger for money, roused them into tumult and activity in a moment. 2 of you for more lanterns, if you have them. 2 of you for the pickaxes and the tools. The rest after me to find the beam. They cheered. With the shrill, starveling voices they cheered. The women and the children fled back on either side. We rushed in a body down the churchyard path to the first empty cottage. Not a man was left behind but the clerk, the poor old clerk, standing on the flat tombstones, sobbing and wailing over the church. The servant was still at my heels. His white, helpless, panic-stricken face was close over my shoulder as we pushed into the cottage. There were rafters from the torn-down floor above, lying loose on the ground, but they were too light. A beam ran across over our heads, but it was out of reach of our arms and our pickaxes. A beam fast at each end in the ruined wall, with ceiling and flooring all ripped away, and a great gap at the roof above open to the sky. We attacked the beam at both ends at once. God, how it held! How the brick and mortar of the wall resisted us! We struck and tugged and tore. The beam gave at one end. It came down with a lump of brickwork after it. There was a scream from all the women, all huddled in the doorway, to look at us. A shout from the men. 2 of them down, but not hurt. Another tug all together, and the beam was loose at both ends. We raised it, and gave the word to clear the doorway. Now for the work. Now for the rush at the door. There is the light streaming into the sky, streaming brighter than ever to light us. Steady along the churchyard path, steady with the beam for the rush at the door. 1, 2, 3, and off! Out rings the cheering again, irrepressibly. We have shaken it already. The hinges must give if the lock won't. Another run with the beam. 1, 2, 3, and off! It's loose! And the steady fire darts at us through the crevice all around it. Another and a last rush. The door falls in with a crash. A great hush of awe, a stillness of breathless expectation possesses every living soul of us. We look for the body. The scorching heat on our faces drives us back. We see nothing. Above, below, all through the room we see nothing but a sheet of living fire. "Where is he?" whispered the servant, staring vacantly at the flames. "He's dust and ashes," said the clerk. "And the books are dust and ashes, and, oh, sirs, the church will be dust and ashes soon." Those were the only 2 who spoke. When they were silent again, nothing stirred in the stillness but the bubble and crackle of the flames. Hark! A harsh rattling sound in the distance, then the hollow beat of horses' hoofs at full gallop, then the low roar, the all-predominant tumult of hundreds of human voices clamouring and shouting together. The engine at last! The people around me all turned from the fire and ran eagerly to the brow of the hill. The old clerk tried to go with the rest, but his strength was exhausted. I saw him holding by one of the tombstones. "Save the church!" he cried out faintly, as if the firemen could hear him already. Save the church? The only man who never moved was the servant. There he stood, his eyes fastened on the flames, in a changeless, vacant stare. I spoke to him. I shook him by the arm. He was past rousing. He only whispered once more, "Where is he?" In 10 minutes the engine was in position. The well at the back of the church was feeding it, and the hose was carried to the doorway of the vestry. If help had been wanted from me, I could not have afforded it now. My energy of will was gone. My strength was exhausted. The turmoil of my thoughts was fearfully and suddenly stilled. Now I knew that he was dead. I stood, useless and helpless, looking into the burning room. I saw the fire slowly conquered. The brightness of the glare faded. The steam rose in white clouds, and the smouldering heaps of embers showed red and black through it on the floor. There was a pause, then an advance altogether of the firemen and the police which blocked up the doorway, then a consultation in low voices, and then 2 men were detached from the rest and sent out of the churchyard through the crowd. The crowd drew back on either side in dead silence to let them pass. After a while a great shudder ran through the people, and the living lane widened slowly. The men came back along it with a door from one of the empty houses. They carried it to the vestry and went in. The police closed again round the doorway. The men stole out from among the crowd by twos and threes and stood behind them to be the first to see. Others waited near to be the first to hear. The women and children were among these last. The tidings from the vestry began to flow out among the crowd. They dropped slowly from mouth to mouth until they reached the place where I was standing. I heard the questions and answers repeated again and again in low, eager tones all around me. Have they found him? Yes. Where? Against the door. On his face. Which door? The door that goes into the church. His head was against it. He was down on his face. Is his face burnt? No. Yes, it is. No, scorched, not burnt. He lay on his face, I tell you. Who was he? A lord, they say. No, not a lord. Sir something. Sir means knight. And baronet, too. No. Yes, it does. What do you want in there? No good, you may depend on it. Did he do it on purpose? Burn himself on purpose? I don't mean himself, I mean the vestry. Is he dreadful to look at? Dreadful. Not about the face, though. No, not much about the face. Don't anybody know him? There's a man says he does. Who? A servant, they say. But he's struck stupid like, and the police don't believe him. Don't anybody else know he is? Hush! The loud, clear voice of a man in authority silenced the low hum of talking all around me in an instant. Where is the gentleman who tried to save him? Said the voice. Here, sir, here he is. Dozens of eager faces pressed about me. Dozens of eager arms parted the crowd. The man in authority came up to me with a lantern in his hand. This way, sir, if you please, he said quietly. I was unable to speak to him. I was unable to resist him when he took my arm. I tried to say that I had never seen the dead man in his lifetime, that there was no hope of identifying him by means of a stranger like me. But the words failed my lips. I was faint and silent and helpless. Do you know him, sir? I was standing inside the circle of men. 3 of them opposite to me were holding lanterns low down to the ground. Their eyes and the eyes of all the rest were fixed silently and expectantly on my face. I knew what was at my feet. I knew why they were holding the lanterns so close to the ground. Can you identify him, sir? My eyes dropped slowly. At first I saw nothing under them but coarse canvas cloth. The dripping of the rain on it was audible in the dreadful silence. I looked up along the cloth, and there at the end, stark and grim and black in the yellow light, there was his dead face. So, for the first and last time, I saw him. So, the visitation of God ruled it that he and I should meet.
End of Track 31. Track 32. The Woman in White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Read by
Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Patty Brugman.
Track 32.
The third epoch. 11. The inquest was hurried for certain local reasons which weighed with the coroner and the town authorities. It was held on the afternoon of the next day. I was necessarily one of the witnesses summoned to assist the objects of the investigation. My first proceeding in the morning was to go to the post office and inquire for the letter which I expected from Marian. No change of circumstances, however extraordinary, could affect the one great anxiety which weighed on my mind while I was away from London. The morning's letter, which was the only assurance I could receive that no misfortune had happened in my absence, was still the absorbing interest with which my day began. To my relief, The letter from Marian was at the office waiting for me. Nothing had happened. They were both as safe and as well as when I had left them. Laura sent her love and begged that I should let her know of my return a day beforehand. Her sister added, in explanation of this message, that she had saved nearly a sovereign out of her own private purse, and that she had claimed the privilege of ordering the dinner and giving the dinner which was to celebrate the day of my return. I read these little domestic confidences in the bright morning, with the terrible recollection of what had happened the evening before vivid in my memory. The necessity of sparing Laura any sudden knowledge of the truth was the first consideration which the letter suggested to me. I wrote at once to Marian to tell her what I have told in these pages, presenting the tidings as gradually and gently as I could, and warning her not to let any such thing as a newspaper fall in Laura's way while I was absent. In the case of any other woman, less courageous and less reliable, I might have hesitated before I ventured on unreservedly disclosing the whole truth. But I owed it to Marian to be faithful to my past experience of her, and to trust her as I trusted myself. My letter was necessarily a long one. It occupied me until the time came for proceeding to the inquest. The objects of the legal inquiry were necessarily beset by peculiar complications and difficulties. Besides the investigation into the manner in which the deceased had met his death, there were serious questions to be settled relating to the cause of the fire, to the abstraction of the keys, and to the presence of a stranger in the vestry at the time when the flames broke out. Even the identification of the dead man had not yet been accomplished. The helpless condition of the servant had made the police distrustful of his asserted recognition of his master. They had sent to Knowlesbury overnight to secure the attendance of witnesses who were well acquainted with the personal appearance of Sir Percival Glyde, and they had communicated, the first thing in the morning, with Blackwater Park. These precautions enabled the coroner and jury to settle the question of identity, and to confirm the correctness of the servant's assertion. The evidence offered by competent witnesses, and by the discovery of certain facts, being subsequently strengthened by an examination of the dead man's watch. The crest and the name of Sir Percival Glyde were engraved inside it. The next inquiries related to the fire. The servant and I, and the boy who had heard the light struck in the vestry, were the first witnesses called. The boy gave his evidence clearly enough, but the servant's mind had not yet recovered the shock inflicted on it. He was plainly incapable of assisting the objects of the inquiry, and he was desired to stand down. To my own relief, my examination was not a long one. I had not known the deceased, I had never seen him, I was not aware of his presence in Old Welmingham, and I had not been in the vestry at the finding of the body. All I could prove was that I had stopped at the clerk's cottage to ask my way, that I had heard from him the loss of the keys, that I had accompanied him to the church to render what help I could, that I had seen the fire, that I had heard some person unknown inside the vestry trying vainly to unlock the door, and that I had done what I could, from motives of humanity, to save the man. Other witnesses who had been acquainted with the deceased were asked if they could explain the mystery of his presumed abstraction of the keys, and his presence in the burning room. But the coroner seemed to take it for granted, naturally enough, that I, as a total stranger in the neighbourhood, and a total stranger to Sir Percival Glyde, could not be in a position to offer any evidence on these 2 points. The course that I was myself bound to take when my formal examination had closed seemed clear to me. I did not feel called on to volunteer any statement of my own private convictions. In the first place, because my doing so could serve no practical purpose, now that all proof in support of any surmises of mine was burnt with the burnt register. In the second place, because I could not have intelligibly stated my opinion, my unsupported opinion, without disclosing the whole story of the conspiracy, and producing beyond a doubt the same unsatisfactory effect on the mind of the coroner and the jury which I had already produced on the mind of Mr. Kyle. In these pages, however, and after the time that has now elapsed, no such cautions and restraints as I here described need fetter the free expression of my opinion. I will state briefly, before my pen occupies itself with other events, how my own convictions led me to account for the abstraction of the keys, for the outbreak of the fire, and for the death of the man. The news of my being free on bail drove Sir Percival, as I believe, to his last resources. The attempted attack on the road was one of those resources, and the suppression of all practical proof of his crime by destroying the page of the register on which the forgery had been committed was the other, and the surest of the two. If I could produce no extract from the original book to compare with the certified copy at Knowlesbury, I could produce no positive evidence, and could threaten him with no fatal exposure. All that was necessary to the attainment of his end was that he should get into the vestry unperceived, that he should tear out the page in the register, and that he should leave the vestry again as privately as he had entered it. On this supposition, it is easy to understand why he waited till nightfall before he made the attempt, and why he took advantage of the clerk's absence to possess himself of the keys. Necessity would oblige him to strike a light to find his way to the right register, and common caution would suggest his locking the door on the inside, in case of intrusion on the part of any inquisitive stranger, or on my part if I happened to be in the neighbourhood at the time. I cannot believe that it was any part of his intention to make the destruction of the register appear to be the result of accident, by purposely setting the vestry on fire. The bare chance that prompt assistance might arrive, and that the books might, by the remotest possibility, be saved, would have been enough, on a moment's consideration, to dismiss any idea of this sort from his mind. Remembering the quantity of combustible objects in the vestry, the straw, the papers, the packing-cases, the dry wood, the old worm-eaten presses, all the probabilities, in my estimation, point to the fire as the result of an accident with his matches or his light. His first impulse under these circumstances was doubtless to try to extinguish the flames, and failing in that, his second impulse, ignorant as he was of the state of the lock, had been to attempt to escape by the door which had given him entrance. When I had called to him, the flames must have reached across the door leading into the church, on either side of which the presses extended, and close to which other combustible objects were placed. In all probability, the smoke and flame, confined as they were to the room, had been too much for him when he tried to escape by the inner door. He must have dropped in his death swoon. He must have sunk in the place where he was found, just as I got on the roof to break the skylight window. Even if we had been able afterwards to get into the church and to burst open the door from that side, the delay must have been fatal. He would have been long past saving by that time. We should only have given the flames free ingress into the church which was now preserved, but which, in that event, would have shared the fate of the vestry. There is no doubt in my mind, there can be no doubt in the mind of anyone, that he was a dead man before ever we got to the empty cottage and worked with might and main to tear down the beam. This is the nearest approach of any theory of mine can make towards accounting for the result, which was a visible matter of fact. As I have described them, so events passed to us outside. As I have related it, so his body was found. The inquest was adjourned over one day, no explanation that the eye of the law could recognize having been discovered thus far to account for the mysterious circumstances of the case. It was arranged that more witnesses should be summoned, and that the London solicitor of the deceased should be invited to attend. A medical man was also charged with the duty of reporting on the mental condition of the servant, which appeared at present to debar him from giving any evidence of the least importance. He could only declare in a dazed way that he had been ordered on the night of the fire to wait in the lane, and that he knew nothing else except that the deceased was certainly his master. My own impression was that he had been first used, without any guilty knowledge on his own part, to ascertain the fact of the clerk's absence from home on the previous day, and that he had been afterwards ordered to wait near the church, but out of sight of the vestry, to assist his master in the event of my escaping the attack on the road, and of a collision occurring between Sir Percival and myself. It is necessary to add that the man's own testimony was never obtained to confirm this view. The medical report of him declared that what little mental faculty he possessed was seriously shaken. Nothing satisfactory was extracted from him at the adjourned inquest, and, for aught I know to the contrary, he may never have recovered to this day. I returned to the hotel at Welmingham, so jaded in body and mind, so weakened and depressed by all I had gone through, as to be quite unfit to endure the local gossip about the inquest, and to answer the trivial questions that the talkers addressed to me in the coffee-room. I withdrew from my scanty dinner to my cheap garret chamber, to secure myself a little quiet, and to think undisturbed of Laura and Marian. If I had been a richer man, I would have gone back to London, and I would have comforted myself with the sight of the two dear faces again that night. But I was bound to appear if called on at the adjourned inquest, and doubly bound to answer my bail before the magistrate at Knowlesbury. Our slender resources had suffered already, and the doubtful future, more doubtful than ever now, made me dread decreasing our means unnecessarily by allowing myself an indulgence, even at the small cost of a double railway journey in the carriages of the second class. The next day, the day immediately following the inquest, was left at my own disposal. I began the morning by again applying at the post office for my regular report from Marian. It was waiting for me as before, and it was written throughout in good spirits. I read the letter thankfully, and then set forth with my mind at ease for the day to go to Old Wilmingham, and to view the scene of the fire in the morning light. What changes met me when I got there! Through all the ways of our unintelligible world, the trivial and the terrible walk hand in hand together. The irony of circumstances holds no mortal catastrophe in respect. When I reached the church, the trampled condition of the burial ground was the only serious trace left to tell of the fire and the death. A rough hoarding of boards had been knocked up before the vestry doorway. Rude caricatures were scrawled on it already, and the village children were fighting and shouting for the possession of the best peephole to see through. At the point where I had heard the cry for help from the burning room, on the spot where the panic-stricken servant had dropped to his knees, a fussy flock of poultry was now scrambling for the first choice of worms after the rain, and on the ground at my feet, where the door and its dreadful burden had been laid, a workman's dinner was waiting for him, tied up in a yellow basin, and his faithful cur in charge was yelping at me for coming near the food. The old clerk, looking idly at the slow commencement of the repairs, had only one interest that he could talk about now, the interest of escaping all blame for his own part on account of the accident that had happened. One of the village women, whose white, wild face I remembered the picture of terror when we pulled down the beam, was giggling with another woman, the picture of inanity, over an old washing tub. There is nothing serious in mortality. Solomon in all his glory was Solomon with the elements of the contemptible lurking in every fold of his robes and every corner of his palace. As I left the place, my thoughts turned, not for the first time, to the complete overthrow that all present hope of establishing Laura's identity had now suffered through Sir Percival's death. He was gone, and with him the chance was gone which had been the one object of all my labours and all my hopes. Could I look at my failure from no truer point of view than this? Suppose he had lived. Would that change of circumstances have altered the result? Could I have made my discovery a marketable commodity, even for Laura's sake, after I had found out that the robbery of the rights of others was the essence of Sir Percival's crime? Could I have offered the price of my silence for his confession of the conspiracy, when the effect of that silence must have been to keep the right heir from the estates and the right owner from the name? Impossible. If Sir Percival had lived, the discovery from which, in my ignorance of the true nature of the secret, I had hoped so much, could not have been mine to suppress or to make public, as I thought best, for the vindication of Laura's rights. In common honesty and common honour, I must have gone at once to the stranger whose birthright had been usurped. I must have renounced the victory at the moment when it was mine, by placing my discovery unreservedly in that stranger's hands. I must have faced afresh all the difficulties which stood between me and the one object of my life, exactly as I was resolved in my heart of hearts to face them now. I returned to Wilmingham with my mind composed, feeling more sure of myself and my resolution than I had felt yet. On my way to the hotel, I passed the end of the square in which Mrs. Catterick lived. Should I go back to the house and make another attempt to see her? No. That news of Sir Percival's death, which was the last news she ever expected to hear, must have reached her hours since. All the proceedings at the inquest had been reported in the local paper that morning. There was nothing I could tell her which she did not know already. My interest in making her speak had slackened. I remembered the furtive hatred in her face when she said, "There is no news of Sir Percival that I don't expect, except the news of his death." I remembered the stealthy interest in her eyes when they settled on me at parting, after she had spoken those words. Some instinct, deep in my heart, which I felt to be a true one, made the prospect of again entering her presence repulsive to me. I turned away from the square and went straight back to the hotel. Some hours later, while I was resting in the coffee-room, a letter was placed in my hands by the waiter. It was addressed to me by name, and I found on inquiry that it had been left at the bar by a woman just as it was near dusk, and just before the gas was lighted. She had said nothing, and she had gone away again before there was time to speak to her, or even notice who she was. I opened the letter. It was neither dated nor signed, and the handwriting was palpably disguised. Before I had read the first sentence, however, I knew who my correspondent was. Mrs. Catherick. The letter ran as follows. I copy it exactly, word for word.
The story continued by Mrs. Catherick. Sir, you have not come back as you said you would. No matter, I know the news, and I write to tell you so. Did you see anything in particular in my face when you left me? I was wondering in my own mind whether the day of his downfall had come at last, and whether you were the chosen instrument for working it. You were, and you have worked it. You were weak enough, as I have heard, to try and save his life. If you had succeeded, I should have looked upon you as my enemy. Now you have failed. I hold you as my friend. Your inquiries frightened him into the vestry by night. Your inquiries without your privity and against your will have served the hatred and wreaked the vengeance of 23 years. Thank you, sir, in spite of yourself. I owe something to the man who has done this. How can I pay my debt? If I was a young woman, still I might say, "Come, put your arm around my waist and kiss me if you like." I should have been fond enough of you even to go that length, and you would have accepted my invitation. You would, sir, 20 years ago. But I am an old woman now. Well, I can satisfy your curiosity and pay my debt in that way. You had a great curiosity to know certain private affairs of mine when you came to see me, private affairs which all your sharpness could not look into without my help, private affairs which you have not discovered even now. You shall discover them. Your curiosity shall be satisfied. I will take any trouble to please you, my estimable young friend. You were a little boy, I suppose, in the year 27. I was a handsome young woman at that time, living at Old Wellingham. I had a contemptible fool for a husband. I had also the honour of being acquainted, never mind how, with a certain gentleman, never mind whom. I shall not call him by his name. Why should I? It was not his own. He never had a name. You know that by this time as well as I do. It will be more to the purpose to tell you how he worked himself into my good graces. I was born with the tastes of a lady, and he gratified them. In other words, he admired me, and he made me presents. No woman can resist admiration and presents, especially presents provided they happen to be just the thing she wants. He was sharp enough to know that most men are. Naturally, he wanted something in return. All men do. And what do you think was the something? The merest trifle. Nothing but the key of the vestry, the key of the press inside it, when my husband's back was turned. Of course he lied when I asked him why he wished me to get him the keys in that private way. He might have saved himself the trouble. I didn't believe him. I liked my presents, and I wanted more. So I got him the keys without my husband's knowledge, and I watched him without his knowledge. Once, twice, 4 times I watched him, and the 4th time I found him out. I was never over-scrupulous where other people's affairs were concerned, and I was not over-scrupulous about his adding one of the marriages in the register of his own account. Of course I knew it was wrong, but it did no harm to me, which was one good reason for not making a fuss about it. And I had not got a gold watch and chain, which was another, still better. And he had promised me one from London only the day before, which was the 3rd and best of all. If I had known what the law considered the crime to be, and how the law punished it, I should have taken proper care of myself and have exposed him then and there. but I knew nothing, and I longed for the gold watch. All the conditions I insisted on were that he should take me into his confidence and tell me everything. I was as curious about his affairs then as you are about mine now. He granted my conditions. Why, you will see presently. This, put in short, is what I heard from him. He did not willingly tell me all that I tell you here. I drew some of it from him by persuasion and some of it by questions. I was determined to have all the truth, and I believe I got it. He knew no more than anyone else of what the state of things really was between his father and mother till after the mother's death. Then his father confessed it and promised to do what he could for his son. He died having done nothing, not having even made a will. The son, who can blame him, wisely provided for himself. He came to England at once, and took possession of the property. There was no one to suspect him, and no one to say nay. His father and mother had always lived as man and wife. None of the people who were acquainted with them ever supposed them to be anything else. The right person to claim the property, if the truth had been known, was a distant relation who had no idea of ever getting it, and who was away at sea when his father died. He had no difficulty so far. He took possession as a matter of course, but he could not borrow money on the property as a matter of course. There were two things wanted of him before he could do this. One was a certificate of his birth, and the other was a certificate of his parents' marriage. The certificate of his birth was easily got. He was born abroad, and the certificate was there in due form. The other matter was a difficulty, and that difficulty brought him to Old Welmingham. But for one consideration he might have gone to Knowlesbury instead. His mother had been living there just before she met with his father, living under her maiden name, the truth being that she was really a married woman, married in Ireland, where her husband had ill-used her and had afterwards gone off with some other person. I give you this fact on good authority. Sir Felix mentioned it to his son as the reason why he had not married. You may wonder why the son, knowing that his parents had met each other at Knowlesbury, did not play his first tricks with the register of that church, where it might have been fairly presumed his father and mother were married. The reason was that the clergyman who did duty at Knowlesbury Church in the year of 1803, when according to his birth certificate his father and mother ought to have been married, was alive still when he took possession of the property in the new year of 1827. This awkward circumstance forced him to extend his inquiries to our neighbourhood. There no such danger existed, the former clergyman at our church having been dead for some years. Old Wellingham suited his purpose as well as Knowlesbury. His father had removed his mother from Knowlesbury, and had lived with her at a cottage on the river, at a little distance from our village. People had known his solitary ways when he was single, did not wonder at his solitary ways when he was supposed to be married. If he had not been a hideous creature to look at, his retired life with a lady might have raised suspicions. But as things were, his hiding, his ugliness, and his deformity in the strictest privacy surprised nobody. He lived in our neighbourhood till he came in possession of the park. After 3 or 20 years had passed, who was to say, the clergyman being dead, that this marriage had not been as private as the rest of his life, and that it had not taken place at Old Welmingham Church. So, as I told you, the son found our neighbourhood the surest place he could choose to set things right, secretly, in his own interests. It may surprise you to hear that what he really did to the marriage register was done on the spur of the moment, done on second thoughts. His first notion was only to tear the leaf out in the right year and month, to destroy it privately, to go back to London, and to tell the lawyers to get him the necessary certificate of his father's marriage, innocently referring them, of course, to the date on the leaf that was gone. Nobody could say his father and mother had not been married after that, and whether, under the circumstances, they would stretch a point or not about lending him the money. He thought they would. He had his answer ready at all events, if a question was ever raised about his right to the name and the estate. But when he came to look privately at the register for himself, he found at the bottom of one of the pages for the year of 1803 a blank space left, seemingly through there being no room to make a long entry there, which had been made instead at the top of the next page. The sight of this chance altered all his plans. It was an opportunity he had never hoped for or thought of, and he took it. You know how. The blank space, to have exactly tallied with his birth certificate, ought to have occurred in the July part of the register. It occurred in the September part instead. However, in this case, if suspicious questions were asked, the answer was not hard to find. He had only to describe himself as a 7-month child. I was fool enough, when he told me his story, to feel some interest and some pity for him, which was just what he calculated on, as you will see. I thought him hardly used. It was not his fault that his father and mother were not married, and it was not his father's and mother's fault either. A more scrupulous woman than I was, a woman who had not set her heart on a gold watch and chain, would have found some excuses for him. At all events, I held my tongue and helped to screen what he was about. He came some time, getting the ink the right color, mixing it over and over again in pots and bottles of mine, and some time afterward in practicing the handwriting. But he succeeded in the end, and made an honest woman of his mother after she was dead in her grave. So far, I don't deny that he behaved honorably enough to myself. He gave me my watch and chain, and spared no expense in buying them. Both were of superior workmanship, and very expensive. I have got them still. The watch goes beautifully. You said the other day that Mrs. Clements had told you everything she knew. In that case, there is no need for me to write about the trumpery scandal by which I was the sufferer, the innocent sufferer, I positively assert. You must know as well as I do what the notion was which my husband took into his head when he found me and my fine gentleman acquaintance meeting each other privately and talking secrets together. But what you don't know is how it ended between that same gentleman and myself. You shall read and see how he behaved to me. The first words I said to him, when I saw the turn things had taken, were, "Do me justice, clear my character of the stain on it, which you know I don't deserve. I don't want you to make a clean breast of it to my husband. Only tell him on your word as a gentleman that he is wrong, and that I am not to blame in the way he thinks I am. Do me that justice, at least, after all I have done for you." He flatly refused in so many words. He told me plainly that it was his interest to let my husband and all my neighbours believe the falsehood, because as long as they did so, they were quite certain never to suspect the truth. I had a spirit of my own, and I told him they should know the truth from my lips. His reply was short and to the point. If I spoke, I was a lost woman as certainly as he was a lost man. Yes, it had come to that. He had deceived me about the risk I ran in helping him. He had practiced my ignorance. He had tempted me with his gifts. He had interested me with his story. And the result of it was that he made me his accomplice. He owned this coolly, and he ended by telling me for the first time what the frightful punishment really was for his offence, and for anyone who helped him to commit it. In those days the law was not so tender-hearted as I hear it is now. Murderers were not the only people liable to be hanged, and women convicts were not treated like ladies in undeserved distress. I confess he frightened me, the mean impostor, the cowardly blackguard. Do you understand now how I hated him? Do you understand why I am taking all this trouble, thankfully taking it, to gratify the curiosity of the meritorious young gentleman who hunted him down? Well, to go on, he was hardly fool enough to drive me to downright desperation. I was not the sort of woman who it was quite safe to hunt into a corner. He knew that, and wisely quieted me with proposals for the future. I deserved some reward, he was kind enough to say, for the service I had done him, and some compensation, he was so obliging as to add, for what I had suffered. He was quite willing, generous scoundrel, to make me a handsome yearly allowance, payable quarterly, on 2 conditions. First, I was to hold my tongue, in my own interests as well as in his. Secondly, I was not to stir away from Wilmingham without first letting him know, and waiting till I had obtained his permission. In my own neighbourhood, no virtuous female friends would tempt me into dangerous gossiping at the tea-table. In my own neighbourhood, he would always know where to find me. A hard condition, that second one, but I accepted it. What else was I to do? I was left helpless, with the prospect of a coming encumbrance in the shape of a child. What else was I to do? Cast myself on the mercy of my runaway idiot of a husband who had raised the scandal against me? I would have died first. Besides, the allowance was a handsome one. I had a better income, a better house over my head, and better carpets on my floor than half the women who turned up the whites of their eyes at the sight of me. The dress of virtue in our parts was cotton print. I had silk. So I accepted the conditions he offered me, and made the best of them, and fought my battle with the respectable neighbours of their own ground, and won it in course of time, as you saw yourself. How I kept his secret and mine through all the years that have passed from that time to this, and whether my late daughter, Anne, ever really crept into my confidence and got the keeping of the secret too, are questions, I dare say, to which you are curious to find an answer. Well, my gratitude refuses you nothing. I will turn a fresh page and give you the answer immediately. But you must excuse one thing. You must excuse my beginning, Mr. Hartright, with an expression of surprise at the interest which you appear to have felt in my late daughter. It is quite unaccountable to me. If that interest makes you anxious for any particulars of her early life, I must refer you to Mrs. Clements, who knows more of the subject than I do. Pray understand that I do not profess to have been at all over-fond of my late daughter. She was a worry to me from the first to the last, with the additional disadvantage of always being weak in the head. You like candour, and I hope this satisfies you. There is no need to trouble you with many personal particulars relating to those past times. It will be enough to say that I observed the terms of the bargain on my side, and that I enjoyed my comfortable income in return, paid quarterly. Now and then I got away and changed the scene for a short time, always asking leave of my lord and master first, and generally getting it. He was not, as I have already told you, fool enough to drive me too hard, and he could reasonably rely on my holding my tongue for my own sake, if not for his. One of my longest trips away from home was the trip I took to Limmeridge to nurse a half-sister there who was dying. She was reported to have saved money, and I thought it as well, in case any accident happened to stop my allowance, to look after my own interests in that direction. As things turned out, however, my pains were all thrown away, and I got nothing, because nothing was to be had. If I had taken Anne to the north with me, having my whims and fancies occasionally about my child, and getting at such times jealous of Mrs. Clements' influence over her, I never liked Mrs. Clements. She was a poor, empty-headed, spiritless woman, what you call a born drudge, and I was now and then not averse to plaguing her by taking Anne away. Not knowing what else to do with my girl while I was nursing in Cumberland, I put her to school in Limmeridge. The lady of the manor, Mrs. Fairlie, a remarkably plain-looking woman who had entrapped one of the handsomest men in England into marrying her, amused me wonderfully by taking a violent fancy to my girl. The consequence was she learned nothing in school, and was petted and spoiled at Limmeridge House. Among other whims and fancies which they taught her there, they put some nonsense into her head about always wearing white. Hating white and liking colours myself, I determined to take the nonsense out of her head as soon as we got home again. Strange to say, my daughter resolutely resisted me. When she had got a notion once fixed in her mind, she was, like other half-witted people, as obstinate as a mule in keeping it. We quarrelled finely, and Mrs. Clements, not liking to see it, I suppose offered to take Anne away to live in London with her. I should have said yes, if Mrs. Clements had not sided with my daughter about her dressing herself in white, but being determined she should not dress herself in white, and disliking Mrs. Clements more than ever for taking part against me, I said no, and meant no, and stuck to no. The consequence was, my daughter remained with me, and the consequence of that, in its turn, was that the first serious quarrel that happened about the secret. The circumstance took place long after the time I have just been writing of. I had been settled for years in the new town, and was steadily living down my bad character and slowly gaining ground among the respectable inhabitants. It helped me forward greatly towards this object to have my daughter with me. Her harmlessness and her fancy for dressing in white excited a certain amount of sympathy. I left off opposing her favourite whim on that account, because of some of the sympathy was sure, in course of time, to fall to my share. Some of it did fall. I date my getting a choice of the 2 best sittings to let in the church from that time, and I date the clergyman's first bow from my getting the sittings. Well, being settled in this way, I received a letter one morning from that highly-born gentleman now deceased, in answer to one of mine, warning him, according to agreement, of my wishing to leave the town for a little change of air and scene. The ruffianly side of him must have been uppermost, I suppose, when he got my letter, for he wrote back refusing me in such abominably insolent language that I lost all command over myself, and abused him in my daughter's presence as a low impostor whom I could ruin for life if I chose to open my lips and let out his secret. I said no more about him than that, being brought to my senses as soon as those words had escaped me, by the sight of my daughter's face looking eagerly and curiously at mine. I instantly ordered her out of the room until I composed myself again. My sensations were not pleasant, I can tell you, when I came to reflect upon my own folly. Anne had been more than usually crazy and queer that year, and when I thought of the chance there might be of her repeating my words in town, and mentioning his name in connection with them, if inquisitive people got hold of her, I was finally terrified at the possible consequences. My worst fears for myself, my worst dread of what he might do, led me no farther than this. I was quite unprepared for what really did happen only the next day. On the next day, without any warning to me to expect him, he came to the house. His first words, and the tone in which he spoke them, surely as it was, showed me plainly enough that he had repented already of his insolent answer to my application, and that he had come in a mighty bad temper to try and set matters right again before it was too late. Seeing my daughter in the room with me, I had been afraid to let her out of my sight after what had happened the day before. He ordered her away. They neither of them liked each other, and he vented the ill temper on her, which he was afraid to show me. "Leave us," he said, looking at her over his shoulder. She looked back over her shoulder and waited as if she didn't care to go. "Do you hear?" he roared out. "Leave the room." "Speak to me civilly," says she, getting red in the face. "Turn the idiot out," says he, looking my way. She had always had crazy notions of her own about her dignity, and that word idiot upset her in a moment. Before I could interfere, she stepped up to him in a fine passion. "Beg my pardon directly," says she, "or I'll make it worse for you. I'll let out your secret. I can ruin you for life if I choose to open my lips." My own words, repeated exactly from what I had said the day before, repeated in his presence, as if they had come from herself. He sat down speechless, as white as the paper I am writing on, while I pushed her out of the room. When he recovered himself— No, I am too respectable a woman to mention what he said when he recovered himself. My pen is the pen of a member of the rector's congregation, and a subscriber to the Wednesday lectures on justification by faith. How can you expect me to employ it in writing bad language? Suppose for yourself the raging, swearing frenzy of the lowest ruffian in England, and let us get on together, as fast as may be, to the way in which it all ended. It ended, as you probably guess by this time, in his insisting on securing his own safety by shutting her up. I tried to set things right. I told him that she had merely repeated like a parrot the words she had heard me say, that she knew no particulars whatever, because I had mentioned none. I explained that she had affected, out of crazy spite against him, to know what she really did not know, that she only wanted to threaten him and aggravate him for speaking to her as he had just spoken, and that my unlucky words gave her just the chance of doing mischief of which she was in search. I referred to him in other queer ways of hers, and to his own experience of the vagaries of half-witted people. It was all to no purpose. He would not believe me on my oath. He was absolutely certain I had betrayed the whole secret. In short, he would hear of nothing but shutting her up. Under these circumstances, I did my duty as a mother. "No pauper asylum," I said. "I won't have her put in a pauper asylum. A private establishment, if you please. I have my feelings as a mother, and my character to preserve in this town, and I will submit to nothing but a private establishment, of the sort which my genteel neighbours would choose for afflicted relatives of their own." Those were my words. It is gratifying to me to reflect that I did my duty. Though never over-fond of my late daughter, I had a proper pride about her. No pauper stain, thanks to my firmness and resolution, ever rested on my child. Having carried my point, which I did the more easily in consequence of the facilities offered by private asylums, I could not refuse to admit that there were certain advantages gained by shutting her up. In the first place, she was taken excellent care of, being treated, as I took care to mention in the town, on the footing of a lady. In the second place, she was kept away from Wellingham, where she might have set people suspecting and inquiring by repeating my own incautious words. The only drawback of putting her under restraint was a very slight one. We merely turned her empty boast about knowing the secret into a fixed delusion. Having first spoken in sheer crazy spitefulness against the man who had offended her, she was cunning enough to see that she had seriously frightened him, and sharp enough afterward to discover that he was concerned in shutting her up. The consequence was she flamed out into a perfect frenzy of passion against him. Going to the asylum, and the first words she said to the nurses after they had quieted her were that she was put in confinement for knowing his secret, and that she meant to open her lips and ruin him when the right time came. She may have said the same thing to you when you thoughtlessly assisted her escape. She certainly said it, as I heard last summer, to the unfortunate woman who married our sweet-tempered, nameless gentleman lately deceased. If either you or that unlucky lady had questioned my daughter closely, and had insisted on her explaining what she really meant, you would have found her lose all her self-importance suddenly, and get vacant and restless and confused. You would have discovered that I am writing nothing here but the plain truth. She knew that there was a secret. She knew who was connected with it. She knew who would suffer by its being known. And beyond that, whatever airs of importance she may have given herself, whatever crazy boasting she may have indulged in with strangers, she never to her dying day knew more. Have I satisfied your curiosity? I have taken pains enough to satisfy it at any rate. There is really nothing else I have to tell you about myself or my daughter. My worst responsibilities, so far as she was concerned, were all over when she was secured in the asylum. I had a form of letter relating to the circumstances under which she was shut up, given me to write in answer to one Miss Halcombe, who was curious in the matter, and who must have heard plenty of lies about me from a certain tongue well accustomed to telling of the same. And I did what I could afterwards to trace my runaway daughter, and prevent her from doing mischief by making inquiries myself in the neighbourhood where she was falsely reported to have been seen. But these, and other trifles like them, are of little or no interest to you after what you have already heard. So far I have written in the friendliest possible spirit, but I cannot close this letter without adding a word here of serious remonstrance and reproof addressed to yourself. In the course of your personal interview with me, you audaciously referred to my late daughter's parentage on the father's side, as if that parentage was a matter of doubt. This was highly improper and very ungentlemanlike on your part. If we see each other again, remember, if you please, that I will allow no liberties to be taken with my reputation, and that the moral atmosphere of Wellingham, to use a favourite expression of my friend the rector's, must not be tainted by loose conversation of any kind. If you allow yourself to doubt that my husband was Anne's father, you personally insult me in the grossest manner. If you have felt And if you still continue to feel an unhallowed curiosity on this subject, I recommend you, in your own interests, to check it at once and forever. On this side of the grave, Mr. Hartright, whatever may happen on the other, that curiosity will never be gratified. Perhaps after what I have just said, you will see the necessity of writing me an apology. Do so, and I will willingly receive it. I will afterwards, if your wishes point to a second interview with me, go a step farther and receive you. My circumstances only enable me to invite you to tea, not that they are at all altered for the worse by what has happened. I have always lived, as I think I told you, well within my income, and I have saved enough in the last 20 years to make me quite comfortable for the rest of my life. It is not my intention to leave Wellingham. There are 1 or 2 little advantages which I have still to gain in the town. The clergyman bows to me, as you saw. He is married, and his wife is not quite so civil. I propose to join the Dorcas Society, and I mean to make the clergyman's wife bow to me next. If you favour me with your company, pray understand that the conversation must be entirely on general subjects. Any attempted reference to this letter will be quite useless. I am determined not to acknowledge having written it. The evidence has been destroyed in the fire, I know, but I think it desirable to err on the side of caution, nevertheless. On this account, no names are mentioned here, nor is any signature attached to these lines. The handwriting is disguised throughout, and I mean to deliver the letter myself, under circumstances which will prevent all fear of its being traced to my house. You can have no possible cause to complain of these precautions, seeing that they do not affect the information I here communicate, in consideration of the special indulgence which you have deserved at my hands. My hour for tea is 5:30, and my buttered toast waits for nobody.
End of Track 32. Track 33. The Woman in White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Read by
Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Track 33.
The story continued by Walter Hartright. 1. My first impulse after reading Mrs. Catherick's extraordinary narrative was to destroy it. The hardened, shameless depravity of the whole composition, from beginning to end, the atrocious perversity of mind which persistently associated me with a calamity for which I was in no sense answerable, and with a death which I had risked my life in trying to avert, so disgusted me that I was on the point of tearing the letter, when a consideration suggested itself which warned me to wait a little before I destroyed it. This consideration was entirely unconnected with Sir Percival. The information communicated to me, so far as it concerned him, did little more than confirm the conclusions at which I had already arrived. He had committed his offence as I had supposed him to have committed it, and the absence of all reference on Mrs. Catherick's part to the duplicate register at Knowlesbury strengthened my previous conviction that the existence of the book, and the risk of detection which it implied, must have been necessarily unknown to Sir Percival. My interest in the question of the forgery was now at an end, and my only object in keeping the letter was to make it of some future service in clearing up the last mystery that still remained to baffle me, the parentage of Anne Catherick on the father's side. There were 1 or 2 sentences dropped in her mother's narrative, which it might be useful to refer to again, when matters of more immediate importance allowed me leisure to search for the missing evidence. I did not despair of still finding that evidence, and I had lost none of my anxiety to discover it, for I had lost none of my interest in tracing the father of the poor creature who now lay at rest in Mrs. Fairlie's grave. Accordingly, I sealed up the letter and put it away carefully in my pocket-book, to be referred to again when the time came. The next day was my last in Hampshire. when I had appeared again before the magistrate at Knowlesbury, and when I had attended the adjourned inquest, I should be free to return to London by the afternoon or the evening train. My first errand in the morning was, as usual, to the post office. The letter from Marian was there, but I thought, when it was handed to me, that it felt unusually light. I anxiously opened the envelope. There was nothing inside but a small strip of paper folded in two. The few hurriedly written lines which were traced on it contained these words: "Come back as soon as you can. I've been obliged to move. Come to Gower's Walk, Fulham, No. 5. I will be on the lookout for you. Don't be alarmed about us. We are both safe and well, but come back. Marian." The news which those lines contained, news which I instantly associated with some attempted treachery on the part of Count Fosco, fairly overwhelmed me. I stood breathless with the paper crumpled up in my hand. What had happened? What subtle wickedness had the Count planned and executed in my absence? A night had passed since Marian's note was written. Hours must elapse still before I could get back to them. Some new disaster might have happened already, of which I was ignorant, and here, miles and miles away from them, here I must remain, doubly held, at the disposal of the law. I hardly know to what forgetfulness of my obligations, anxiety and alarm might not have tempted me, but for the quieting influence of my faith in Marian. My absolute reliance on her was the one earthly consideration which helped me to restrain myself, and gave me courage to wait. The inquest was the first of the impediments in the way of my freedom of action. I attended it at the appointed time, the legal formalities requiring my presence in the room, but, as it turned out, not calling on me to repeat my evidence. This useless delay was a hard trial, although I did my best to quiet my impatience by following the course of the proceedings as closely as I could. The London solicitor of the deceased, Mr. Merriman, was among the persons present, but he was quite unable to assist the objects of the inquiry. He could only say that he was inexpressibly shocked and astonished, and that he could throw no light whatever on the mysterious circumstances of the case. At intervals during the adjourned investigation, he suggested questions which the coroner put, but which led to no results. After a patient inquiry, which lasted nearly 3 hours, and which exhausted every available source of information, the jury pronounced the customary verdict in cases of sudden death by accident. They added to the formal decision a statement that there had been no evidence to show how the keys had been abstracted, how the fire had been caused, or what the purpose was for which the deceased had entered the vestry. This act closed the proceedings. The legal representative of the dead man was left to provide for the necessities of the interment, and the witnesses were free to retire. Resolved not to lose a minute in getting to Knowlesbury, I paid my bill at the hotel and hired a fly to take me to the town. A gentleman who heard me give the order, and who saw that I was going alone, informed me that he lived in the neighbourhood of Knowlesbury, and asked if I would have any objection to his getting home by sharing the fly with me. I accepted his proposal as a matter of course. Our conversation during the drive was naturally occupied by the one absorbing subject of local interest. My new acquaintance had some knowledge of the late Sir Percival's solicitor, and he and Mr. Merriman had been discussing the state of the deceased gentleman's affairs, and the succession to the property. Sir Percival's embarrassments were so well known all over the county that his solicitor could only make a virtue of necessity and plainly acknowledge them. He had died without leaving a will, and he had no personal property to bequeath. Even if he'd made one, the whole fortune which he derived from his wife having been swallowed up by his creditors. The heir to the estate, Sir Percival having left no issue, was a son of Sir Felix Glyde's first cousin, an officer in command of an East Indiaman. He would find his unexpected inheritance sadly encumbered, but the property would recover with time, and if the captain was careful, he might be a rich man yet before he died. Absorbed as I was in the one idea of getting to London, this information, which events proved to be perfectly correct, had an interest of its own to attract my attention. I thought it justified me in keeping secret my discovery of Sir Percival's fraud. The heir whose rights he had usurped was the heir who would now have the estate. The income from it for the last 23 years, which should properly have been his, and which the dead man had squandered to the last farthing, was gone beyond recall. If I spoke, my speaking would confer advantage on no one. If I kept the secret, My silence concealed the character of the man who had cheated Laura into marrying him. For her sake I wished to conceal it. For her sake, still, I tell this story under feigned names. I parted with my chance companion at Knowlesbury, and went at once to the town hall. As I had anticipated, no one was present to prosecute the case against me. The necessary formalities were observed, and I was discharged. On leaving the court, a letter from Mr. Dawson was put into my hand. It informed me that he was absent on professional duty, but it reiterated the offer that I had already received from him of any assistance which I might require at his hands. I wrote back, warmly acknowledging my obligations to his kindness and apologizing for not expressing my thanks personally, in consequence of my immediate recall on pressing business to town. Half an hour later I was speeding back to London by the express train.
2. It was between 9 and 10 o'clock before I reached Fulham and found my way to Gower's Walk. Both Laura and Marian came to the door to let me in. I think we had hardly known how close the tie was which bound us three together until the evening came which united us again. We met as if we'd been parted for months instead of for a few days only. Marian's face was sadly worn and anxious. I saw who had known all the danger and borne all the trouble in my absence the moment I looked at her. Laura's brighter looks and better spirits told me how carefully she had been spared all knowledge of the dreadful death at Wilmingham, and of the true reason for our change of abode. The stir of the removal seemed to have cheered and interested her. She spoke of it as a happy thought of Marian's to surprise me on my return with a change from the close, noisy street to the pleasant neighbourhood of trees and fields and the river. She was full of projects for the future, of the drawings she was to finish, of the purchasers I had found in the country who were to buy them, of the shillings and sixpences she had saved, till her purse was so heavy that she proudly asked me to weigh it in my own hand. The change for the better which had been wrought in her during the few days of my absence was a surprise to me, for which I was quite unprepared, and for all the unspeakable happiness of seeing it, I was indebted to Marian's courage and to Marian's love. When Laura had left us, and we could speak to one another without restraint, I tried to give some expression to the gratitude and the admiration which filled my heart. But the generous creature would not wait to hear me. What sublime self-forgetfulness of woman, which yields so much and asks so little, turned all her thoughts from herself to me. I had only a moment left before post-time, she said, or I would have written less abruptly. You look worn and weary, Walter. I'm afraid my letter must seriously have alarmed you. Only at first, I replied. My mind was quietened, Marian, by my trust in you. Was I right in attributing this sudden change of place to some threatening annoyance on the part of Count Fosco? Perfectly right, she said. I saw him yesterday, and worse than that, Walter, I spoke to him. Spoke to him? Did he know where we lived? Did he come to the house? He did. To the house, but not upstairs. Laura never saw him. Laura suspects nothing. I will tell you how it happened. The danger, I believe and hope, is over now. Yesterday I was in the sitting-room at our old lodgings. Laura was drawing at the table, and I was walking about and setting things to rights. I passed the window, and as I passed it, looked out into the street. There, on the opposite side of the way, I saw the Count with a man talking to him. Did he notice you at the window? No, at least I thought not, but I was too violently startled to be quite sure. Who was the other man? A stranger? Not a stranger, Walter. As soon as I could draw my breath again, I recognized him. He was the owner of the lunatic asylum. Was the Count pointing out the house to him? No. They were talking together, as if they had accidentally met in the street. I remained at the window looking at them from behind the curtain. If I had turned round, and if Laura had seen my face at that moment, thank God she was absorbed over her drawing. They soon parted. The man from the asylum went one way, and the Count the other. I began to hope they were in the street by chance, till I saw the Count come back, stop opposite us again, take out his card-case and pencil, write something, then cross the road to the shop below us. I ran past Laura before she could see me, and said I'd forgotten something upstairs. As soon as I was out of the room, I went down to the first landing and waited. I was determined to stop him if he tried to come upstairs. He made no such attempt, The girl from the shop came through the door into the passage with his card in her hand, a large gilt card with his name, and a coronet above it, and these lines underneath in pencil. "Dear lady," yes, the villain could address me in that way still. "Dear lady, one word I implore you on a matter serious to us both." If one can think at all in serious difficulties, one thinks quick. I felt directly that it might be a fatal mistake to leave myself and to leave you in the dark, where such a man as the Count was concerned. I felt that the doubt of what he might do in your absence would be 10 times more trying to me if I declined to see him than if I consented. "Ask the gentleman to wait in the shop," I said. "I'll be with him in a moment." I ran upstairs for my bonnet, being determined not to let him speak to me indoors. I knew his deep, ringing voice, and I was afraid Laura might hear it even in the shop. In less than a minute I was down again in the passage, and had opened the door into the street. He came round to meet me from the shop. There he was, in deep mourning, with his smooth brow and his deadly smile, and some idle boys and women near him, staring at his great size, his fine black clothes, his large cane with the gold knob on it. All the horrible time at Blackwater came back to me the moment I set eyes on him. All the old loathing crept and crawled through me when he took off his hat with a flourish and spoke to me, as if we had parted on the friendliest terms hardly a day since. You remember what he said? I can't repeat it, Walter. You shall know directly what he said about you, but I can't repeat what he said to me. It was worse than the polite insolence of his letter. My hands tingled to strike him, as if I had been a man. I only kept them quiet by tearing his card to pieces under my shawl. Without saying a word on my side, I walked away from the house for fear of Laura seeing us, and he followed, protesting softly all the way. In the first by-street I turned and asked him what he wanted with me. He wanted 2 things. First, if I had no objection to express his sentiments, I declined to hear them. Secondly, to repeat the warning in his letter. I asked what occasion there was for repeating it. He bowed and smiled, and said he would explain. The explanation exactly confirmed the fears I expressed before you left us. I told you, if you remember, that Sir Percival would be too headstrong to take his friend's advice where you were concerned, and that there was no danger to be dreaded from the Count until his own interests were threatened, and he was roused into acting for himself. I recollect, Marian. Well, so it really turned out. The Count offered his advice, but it was refused. Sir Percival would only take counsel of his own violence, his own obstinacy, and his own hatred of you. The Count let him have his way, first privately ascertaining, in case of his own interests being threatened next, where we lived. You were followed, Walter, on returning here after your first journey to Hampshire, by the lawyer's men for some distance from the railway, and by the Count himself to the door of the house. How he contrived to escape being seen by you he did not tell me, but he found us out on that occasion and in that way. Having made the discovery, he took no advantage of it till the news reached him of Sir Percival's death. And then, as I told you, he acted for himself, because he believed you would next proceed against the dead man's partner in the conspiracy. He at once made his arrangements to keep the owner of the asylum in London, and to take him to the place where his runaway patient was hidden, believing that the results, whichever way they ended, would be to involve you in interminable legal disputes and difficulties, and to tie your hands for all purposes of offence, so far as he was concerned. That was his purpose, on his own confession to me. The only consideration which made him hesitate at the last moment, yes, it's hard to acknowledge it, Walter, yet I must. I was the only consideration. No words can say how degraded I feel in my own estimation when I think of it. But the one weak point in that man's iron character is the horrible admiration he feels for me. I've tried, for the sake of my own self-respect, to disbelieve it as long as I could. But his looks, his actions, force on me the shameful conviction of the truth. The eyes of that monster of wickedness moistened while he was speaking to me. They did, Walter. He declared that at the moment of pointing out the house to the doctor, he thought of the misery if I was separated from Laura, of my responsibility if I was called on to answer for effecting her escape. And he risked the worst that you could do to him the second time, for my sake. All he asked was that I would remember the sacrifice and restrain your rashness, in my own interests, interests which he might never be able to consult again. I made no such bargain with him. I would have died first. But, believe him or not, whether it's true or false that he sent the doctor away with an excuse, one thing is certain. I saw the man leave him without so much as a glance at our window, or even at our side of the way. I believe it, Marian. The best men are not consistent in good. Why should the worst men be consistent in evil? At the same time, I suspect him of merely attempting to frighten you, by threatening what he cannot really do. I doubt his power of annoying us by means of the owner of the asylum, now that Sir Percival is dead, and Mrs. Catherick is free from all control. But let me hear more. What did the Count say of me? He spoke last of you. His eyes brightened and hardened, and his manner changed to what I remembered it into past times, to that mixture of pitiless resolution and mountebank mockery, which makes it so impossible to fathom him. "Warn Mr. Hartright," he said in his loftiest manner. "He has a man of brains to deal with, a man who snaps his big fingers at the laws and conventions of society when he measures himself with me. If my lamented friend had taken my advice, the business of the inquest would have been with the body of Mr. Hartright. But my lamented friend was obstinate. See, I mourn his loss inwardly in my soul, outwardly on my hat. This trivial crape expresses sensibilities which I summon Mr. Hartright to respect. They may be transformed to immeasurable enmities if he ventures to disturb them. Let him be content with what he has got, with what I leave unmolested for your sake to him and to you. Say to him, with my compliments, if he stirs me, he has Fosco to deal with. In the English of the popular tongue, I inform him, Fosco sticks at nothing. Dear lady, good morning." His cold grey eyes settled on my face. He took off his hat solemnly, bowed bareheaded, and left me, without returning, without saying more last words. He turned at the corner of the street and waved his hand, and then struck it theatrically on his breast. I lost sight of him after that. He disappeared in the opposite direction to our house, and I ran back to Laura. Before I was indoors again, I had made up my mind that we must go. The house, especially in your absence, was a place of danger instead of a place of safety, now that the Count had discovered it. If I could have felt certain of your return, I should have risked waiting till you came back. But I was certain of nothing, and I acted at once on my own impulse. You had spoken before leaving us of moving us into a quieter neighbourhood and purer air for the sake of Laura's health. I had only to remind her of that, and to suggest surprising you and saving you trouble by managing the move in your absence, to make her quite as anxious for the change as I was. She helped me to pack up your things, and she's arranged them all for you in your new working room here. What made you think of coming to this place? My ignorance of other localities in the neighbourhood of London. I felt the necessity of getting as far away as possible from our old lodgings, and I knew something of Fulham, because I'd once been at school there. I dispatched a messenger with a note on the chance that the school might still be in existence. It was in existence. The daughters of my old mistress were carrying it on for her, and they engaged this place from the instructions I'd sent. It was just post-time when the messenger returned to me with the address of the house. We moved after dark. We came here quite unobserved. Have I done right, Walter? Have I justified your trust in me?" I answered her warmly and gratefully, as I really felt. But the anxious look still remained on her face while I was speaking, and the first question she asked when I had done related to Count Fosco. I saw that she was thinking of him now with a changed mind. No fresh outbreak of anger against him, no new appeal to me to hasten the day of reckoning escaped her. Her conviction that the man's hateful admiration of herself was really sincere seemed to have increased 100-fold. Her distrust of his unfathomable cunning, her inborn dread of the wicked energy and vigilance of all his faculties. Her voice fell low. Her manner was hesitating. Her eyes searched into mine with an eager fear when she asked me what I thought of his message, and what I meant to do next after hearing it. "Not many weeks have passed, Marian," I answered, "since my interview with Mr. Kyle. When he and I parted, the last words I said to him about Laura were these: Her uncle's house shall open to receive her, in the presence of every soul who followed the false funeral to the grave. The lie that records her death shall be publicly erased from the tombstone by the authority of the head of the family, and the 2 men who wronged her shall answer for their crime to me, though the justice that sits in tribunals is powerless to pursue them. One of those men is beyond mortal reach. The other remains, and my resolution remains." Her eyes lit up. Her colour rose. She said nothing, but I saw all her sympathies gathering to mine in her face. "I don't disguise from myself or from you," I went on. "The prospect before us is more than doubtful. The risks we have run already are, it may be, trifles compared with the risks that threaten us in the future. But the venture shall be tried, Marian, for all that. I'm not rash enough to measure myself against such a man as the Count before I am well prepared for him. I've learnt patience. I can wait my time. Let him believe that his message has produced its effect. Let him know nothing of us and hear nothing of us. Let us give him full time to feel secure. His own boastful nature, unless I seriously mistake him, will hasten that result. This is one reason for waiting, but there's another more important still. My position, Marian, towards you and towards Laura ought to be a stronger one than it is now, before I try our last chance." She leaned near to me with a look of surprise. "How can it be stronger?" she asked. "I'll tell you," I replied, "when the time comes. It has not come yet. It may never come at all. I may be silent about it to Laura forever. I must be silent now even to you, till I see for myself that I can harmlessly and honourably speak. Let us leave that subject. There's another which has more pressing claims on our attention. You've kept Laura, mercifully kept her, in ignorance of her husband's death. Oh, Walter, surely it must be long yet before we tell her of it." "No, Marian. Better that you should reveal it to her now, than that accident, which no one can guard against, should reveal it to her at some future time. Spare her all the details, break it to her very tenderly, but tell her that he is dead." "You have a reason, Walter, for wishing her to know of her husband's death, besides the reason you have just mentioned?" "I have." "A reason connected with the subject which must not be mentioned between us yet? Which may never be mentioned to Laura at all?" She dwelt on the last words meaningfully. When I answered her in the affirmative, I dwelt on them too. Her face grew pale. For a while she looked at me with a sad, hesitating interest. An unaccustomed tenderness trembled in her dark eyes and softened her firm lips as she glanced aside at the empty chair in which the dear companion of all our joys and sorrows had been sitting. "I think I understand," she said. "I think I owe it to her and to you, Walter, to tell her of her husband's death." She sighed and held my hand fast for a moment, then dropped it abruptly and left the room. On the next day, Laura knew that his death had released her, and that the error and the calamity of her life lay buried in his tomb. His name was mentioned among us no more. Thenceforward we shrank from the slightest approach to the subject of his death, and in the same scrupulous manner Marian and I avoided all further reference to that other subject, which, by her consent and mine, was not to be mentioned between us yet. It was not the less present in our minds. It was rather kept alive in them by the restraint which we had imposed on ourselves. We both watched Laura more anxiously than ever, sometimes waiting and hoping, sometimes waiting and fearing, till the time came. By degrees we returned to our accustomed way of life. I resumed the daily work which had been suspended during my absence in Hampshire. Our new lodgings cost us more than the smaller and less convenient rooms which we had left, and the claims thus implied on my increased exertions were strengthened by the doubtfulness of our future prospects. Emergencies might yet happen which would exhaust our little fund at the banker's, and the work of my hands might be ultimately all we had to look to for support. More permanent and more lucrative employment than had yet been offered to me was a necessity for our position, a necessity for which I now diligently set myself to provide. It must not be supposed that the interval of rest and seclusion of which I am now writing entirely suspended on my part all pursuit of the one absorbing purpose with which my thoughts and actions are associated in these pages. That purpose was, for months and months yet, never to relax its claims on me. The slow ripening of it still left me a measure of precaution to take, an obligation of gratitude to perform, and a doubtful question to solve. The measure of precaution related necessarily to the Count. It was of the last importance to ascertain, if possible, whether his plans committed him to remaining in England, or, in other words, to remaining within my reach. I contrived to set this doubt at rest by very simple means. His address in St. John's Wood being known to me, I inquired in the neighbourhood, and having found out the agent who had the disposal of the furnished house in which he lived, I asked if number 5, Forest Road, was likely to be let within a reasonable time. The reply was in the negative. I was informed that the foreign gentleman then residing in the house had renewed his term of occupation for another 6 months, and would remain in possession until the end of June in the following year. We were then at the beginning of December only. I left the agent with my mind relieved from all present fear of the Count's escaping me. The obligation I had to perform took me once more into the presence of Mrs. Clements. I had promised to return and to confide to her those particulars relating to the death and burial of Anne Catherick, which I had been obliged to withhold at our first interview. Changed as circumstances now were, there was no hindrance to my trusting the good woman with as much of the story of the conspiracy as it was necessary to tell. I had every reason that sympathy and friendly feeling could suggest to urge on me the speedy performance of my promise, and I did conscientiously and carefully perform it. There's no need to burden these pages with any statement of what passed at the interview. It will be more to the purpose to say that the interview itself necessarily brought to my mind the one doubtful question still remaining to be solved, the question of Anne Catherick's parentage on her father's side. A multitude of small considerations in connection with this subject, trifling enough in themselves but strikingly important when massed together, had latterly led my mind to a conclusion which I resolved to verify. I obtained Marian's permission to write to Major Donthorne of Varneck Hall, where Mrs. Catherick had lived in service for some years previous to her marriage, to ask him certain questions. I made the inquiries in Marian's name, and described them as relating to matters of personal history in her family, which might explain and excuse my application. When I wrote the letter, I had no certain knowledge that Major Donthorne was still alive. I dispatched it on the chance that he might be living and able and willing to reply. After a lapse of 2 days, proof came, in the shape of a letter, that the Major was living, and that he was ready to help us. The idea in my mind when I wrote to him, and the nature of my inquiries, will be easily inferred from his reply. His letter answered my questions by communicating these important facts. In the first place, the late Sir Percival Glyde of Blackwater Park had never set foot in Varneck Hall. The deceased gentleman was a total stranger to Major Donthorne, and to all his family. In the second place, the late Mr. Philip Fairlie of Limmeridge House had been in his younger days the intimate friend and constant guest of Major Donthorne. Having refreshed his memory by looking back to old letters and other private papers, the Major was in a position to say positively that Mr. Philip Fairlie was staying at Varneck Hall in the month of August 1826, and that he remained there for the shooting during the month of September and part of October following. He then left, to the best of the Major's belief, for Scotland, and did not return to Varneck Hall until after a lapse of time, when he reappeared in the character of a newly married man. Taken by itself, this statement was perhaps of little positive value, but taken in connection with certain facts, every one of which either Marian or I knew to be true, it suggested one plain conclusion that was to our minds irresistible. Knowing now that Mr. Philip Fairlie had been at Varneck Hall in the autumn of 1826, and that Mrs. Catherick had been living there in service at the same time, we also knew, first, that Anne had been born in June 1827, secondly, that she had always presented an extraordinary personal resemblance to Laura, and thirdly, that Laura herself was strikingly like her father. Mr. Philip Fairlie had been one of the notoriously handsome men of his time. In disposition, entirely unlike his brother Frederick, He was the spoilt darling of society, especially of the women, an easy, light-hearted, impulsive, affectionate man, generous to a fault, constitutionally lax in his principles, and notoriously thoughtless of moral obligations where women were concerned. Such were the facts we knew. Such was the character of the man. Surely the plain inference that follows needs no pointing out. Read by the new light which had now broken upon me, even Mrs. Catherick's letter, in spite of herself, rendered its mite of assistance towards strengthening the conclusions at which I had arrived. She had described Mrs. Fairlie, in writing to me, as plain-looking, and as having entrapped the handsomest man in England into marrying her. Both assertions were gratuitously made, and both were false. Jealous dislike, which, in such a woman as Mrs. Catherick, would express itself in petty malice rather than not express itself at all, appeared to me to be the only assignable cause for the particular insolence of her references to Mrs. Fairlie, under circumstances which did not necessitate any reference at all. The mention here of Mrs. Fairlie's name naturally suggests one other question. Did she ever suspect whose child the little girl brought to her at Limmeridge might be? Marian's testimony was positive on this point. Mrs. Fairlie's letter to her husband, which had been read to me in former days, the letter describing Anne's resemblance to Laura, and acknowledging her affectionate interest in the little stranger, had been written beyond all question in perfect innocence of heart. It seemed doubtful, on consideration, whether Mr. Philip Fairlie himself had been nearer than his wife to any suspicion of the truth. The disgracefully deceitful circumstances under which Mrs. Catherick had married, the purpose of concealment which the marriage was intended to answer, might well keep her silent for caution's sake, perhaps for her own pride's sake also, even assuming she had the means, in his absence, of communicating with the father of her unborn child. As this surmise floated through my mind, there rose on my memory the remembrance of the Scripture denunciation, which we have all thought of in our time with wonder and with awe, that the sins of the fathers shall be visited on the children. But for the fatal resemblance between the two daughters of one father, the conspiracy of which Anne had been the innocent instrument and Laura the innocent victim could never have been planned. With that unerring and terrible directness the long chain of circumstances led down from the thoughtless wrong committed by the father to the heartless injury inflicted on the child. These thoughts came to me, and others with them, which drew my mind away to the little Cumberland churchyard where Anne Catherick now lay buried. I thought of the bygone days when I had met her by Mrs. Fairlie's grave, and met her for the last time. I thought of her poor helpless hands beating on the tombstone, and her weary yearning words murmuring to the dead remains of her protectress and her friend, "Oh, if I could die and be hidden and at rest with you!" Little more than a year had passed since she breathed that wish, and how inscrutably, how awfully it had been fulfilled. The words she had spoken to Laura by the shores of the lake, the very words had now come true. "Oh, if I could only be buried with your mother! If I could only wake at her side when the angel's trumpet sounds, and the graves give up their dead at the resurrection!" Through what mortal crime and horror, through what darkest windings of the way down to death, the lost creature had wandered in God's leading to the last home that, living, she had never hoped to reach. In that sacred rest I leave her. In that dread companionship let her remain undisturbed. So, the ghostly figure which has haunted these pages, as it haunted my life, goes down to the impenetrable gloom. Like a shadow she first came to me in the loneliness of the night. Like a shadow she passes away in the loneliness of the dead.
End of Track 33.